Welcome to Book Voyage Audio, where every story is an adventure. Sit back, relax, and enjoy your journey. The Jewel of Seven Stars by Bram Stoker. Chapter 1. A Summons in the Night. It all seemed so real that I could hardly imagine that it had ever occurred before, and yet each episode came, not as a fresh step in the logic of things, but as something expected. It is in such a wise that memory plays its pranks. For good or ill, for pleasure or pain, for weal or woe. It is thus that life is bittersweet, and that which has been done becomes eternal. Again, the light skiff, ceasing to shoot through the lazy water as when the oars flashed and dripped, glided out of the fierce July sunlight into the cool shade of the great drooping willow branches, I standing up in the swaying boat, she sitting still and with deft fingers guarding herself from stray twigs, or the freedom of the resilience of moving boughs. Again, the water looked golden brown under the canopy of translucent green, and the grassy bank was of emerald hue. Again, we sat in the cool shade, with the myriad noises of nature both without and within our bower merging into that drowsy hum, in whose sufficing environment the great world, with its disturbing trouble, and its more disturbing joys, can be effectually forgotten. Again, in that blissful solitude the young girl lost the convention of her prim, narrow upbringing, and told me in a natural, dreamy way of the loneliness of her new life. With an undertone of sadness, she made me feel how in that spacious home each one of the household was isolated by the personal magnificence of her father and herself, that their confidence had no altar, and sympathy no shrine, and that there even her father's face was as distant as the old country life seemed now. Once more, the wisdom of my manhood and the experience of my years laid themselves at the girl's feet. It was seemingly their own doing, for the individual, I had no say in the matter, but only just obeyed imperative orders. And once again the flying seconds multiplied themselves endlessly, for it is in the arcana of dreams that existences merge and renew themselves, change, and yet keep the same, like the soul of a musician in a fugue. And so memory swooned, again and again in sleep. It seems that there is never to be any perfect rest. Even in Eden the snake rears its head among the laden boughs of the tree of knowledge. The silence of the dreamless night is broken by the roar of the avalanche, the hissing of sudden floods, the clanging of the engine bell marking its sweep through a sleeping American town, the clanking of distant paddles over the sea. Whatever it is breaking the charm of my Eden. The canopy of greenery above us, starred with diamond points of light, seems to quiver in the ceaseless beat of paddles, and the restless bell seems as though it would never cease. All at once the gates of sleep were thrown wide open, and my waking ears took in the cause of the disturbing sounds. Waking existence is prosaic enough. There was somebody knocking and ringing at someone's street door. I was pretty well accustomed in my German street chambers to passing sounds. Usually I did not concern myself, sleeping or waking, with the doings, however noisy, of my neighbors. But this noise was too continuous, too insistent, too imperative to be ignored. There was some active intelligence behind that ceaseless sound, and some stress or need behind the intelligence. I was not altogether selfish, and at the thought of someone's need I was, without premeditation, out of bed. Instinctively I looked at my watch. It was just 3 o'clock. There was a faint edging of gray round the green blind which darkened my room. It was evident that the knocking and ringing were at the door of our own house, and it was evident, too, that there was no one awake to answer the call. I slipped on my dressing gown and slippers, and went down to the hall door. When I opened it, there stood a dapper groom, with one hand pressed unflinchingly on the electric bell, whilst with the other he raised a ceaseless clangor with the knocker. The instant he saw me, the noise ceased. One hand went up, instinctively, to the brim of his hat, and the other produced a letter from his pocket. A neat brougham was opposite the door. The horses were breathing heavily, as though they had come fast. A policeman, with his night lantern still alight at his belt, stood by, attracted to the spot by the noise. "Beg pardon, sir, I'm sorry for disturbing you, but my orders was imperative. I was not to lose a moment, but to knock and ring till someone came." "May I ask you, sir, if Mr. Malcolm Ross lives here?" "I am Mr. Malcolm Ross." "Then this letter is for you, sir, and the brougham is for you too, sir." I took, with a strange curiosity, the letter which he handed to me. As a barrister, I had had, of course, odd experiences now and then, including sudden demands upon my time, but never anything like this. I stepped back into the hall, closing the door too, but leaving it ajar. Then I switched on the electric light. The letter was directed in a strange hand, a woman's. It began at once without "Dear Sir," or any such address. "You said you would like to help me if I needed it, and I believe you meant what you said. The time has come sooner than I expected. I am in dreadful trouble and do not know where to turn or to whom to apply. An attempt has, I fear, been made to murder my father, though, thank God, he still lives. But he is quite unconscious. The doctors and police have been sent for, but there is no one here whom I can depend on. Come at once if you are able to, and forgive me if you can. I suppose I shall realize later what I have done in asking such a favor, but at present I cannot think. Come at once. Margaret Trelawny." Pain and exultation struggled in my mind as I read, but the mastering thought was that she was in trouble and had called on me. My dreaming of her, then, was not altogether without a cause. I called out to the groom, "Wait, I shall be with you in a minute." Then I flew upstairs. A very few minutes sufficed to wash and dress, and we were soon driving through the streets as fast as the horses could go. It was market morning, and when we got out on Piccadilly, there was an endless stream of carts coming from the west, but for the rest the roadway was clear, and we went quickly. I had told the groom to come into the brougham with me so that he could tell me what had happened as we went along. He sat awkwardly, with his hat on his knees, as he spoke. "Miss Trelawny, sir, sent a man to tell us to get out a carriage at once, and when we was ready she come herself and gave me the letter and told Morgan, the coachman, sir, to fly. She said as I was to lose not a second, but to keep knocking till someone come." "Yes, I know, you told me. What I want to know is why she sent for me. What happened in the house?" "I don't quite know myself, sir, except that master was found in his room, senseless, with the sheets all bloody, and a wound on his head. He couldn't be waked nohow. 'Twas Miss Trelawny herself as found him." "How did she come to find him at such an hour?" "It was late in the night, I suppose." "I don't know, sir. I didn't hear nothing at all of the details." As he could tell me no more, I stopped the carriage for a moment to let him get out on the box. Then I turned the matter over in my mind as I sat alone. There were many things which I could have asked the servant, and for a few moments after he had gone I was angry with myself for not having used my opportunity. On second thought, however, I was glad the temptation was gone. I felt that it would be more delicate to learn what I wanted to know of Miss Trelawny's surroundings from herself, rather than from her servants. We bowled swiftly along Knightsbridge, the small noise of our well-appointed vehicle sounding hollowly in the morning air. We turned up the Kensington Palace Road, and presently stopped opposite a great house on the left-hand side, nearer, so far as I could judge, the Notting Hill than the Kensington end of the avenue. It was a truly fine house, not only with regard to size but to architecture. Even in the dim grey light of the morning, which tends to diminish the size of things, it looked big. Miss Trelawny met me in the hall. She was not in any way shy. She seemed to rule all around her with a sort of hybrid dominance, all the more remarkable as she was greatly agitated and as pale as snow. In the great hall were several servants, the men standing together near the hall door, and the women clinging together in the further corners and doorways. A police superintendent had been talking to Miss Trelawny. 2 men in uniform and 1 plainclothes man stood near him. As she took my hand impulsively, there was a look of relief in her eyes, and she gave a gentle sigh of relief. Her salutation was simple. "I knew you would come." The clasp of the hand can mean a great deal, even when it is not intended to mean anything especially. Miss Trelawny's hand somehow became lost in my own. It was not that it was a small hand, it was fine and flexible with long delicate fingers, a rare and beautiful hand. It was the unconscious self-surrender. And though at the moment I could not dwell on the cause of the thrill which swept me, it came back to me later. She turned and said to the police superintendent, "This is Mr. Malcolm Ross." The police officer saluted as he answered, "I know Mr. Malcolm Ross, miss. Perhaps he will remember I had the honor of working with him in the Brixton coining case." I had not, at first glance, noticed who it was, my whole attention having been taken with Miss Trelawny. "Of course, Superintendent Dolan, I remember very well," I said as we shook hands. I could not but note that the acquaintanceship seemed a relief to Miss Trelawny. There was a certain vague uneasiness in her manner which took my attention. Instinctively, I felt that it would be less embarrassing for her to speak with me alone. So I said to the superintendent, "Perhaps it will be better if Miss Trelawny will see me alone for a few minutes. You, of course, have already heard all she knows, and I shall understand better how things are if I may ask some questions. I will then talk the matter over with you, if I may." "I shall be glad to be of what service I can, sir," he answered heartily. Following Miss Trelawny, I moved over to a dainty room which opened from the hall and looked out on the garden at the back of the house. When we had entered and I had closed the door, she said, "I will thank you later for your goodness in coming to me in my trouble, but at present you can best help me when you know the facts." "Go on," I said. "Tell me all you know and spare no detail, however trivial it may at the present time seem to be." She went on at once. "I was awakened by some sound. I do not know what. I only know that it came through my sleep, for all at once I found myself awake, with my heart beating wildly, listening anxiously for some sound from my father's room. My room is next father's, and I can often hear him moving about before I fall asleep. He works late at night, sometimes very late indeed, so that when I wake early, as I do occasionally, or in the gray of the dawn, I hear him still moving. I tried once to remonstrate with him about staying up so late, as it cannot be good for him, but I never ventured to repeat the experiment. You know how stern and cold he can be. At least you may remember what I told you about him, and when he is polite in this mood, he is dreadful. When he is angry, I can bear it much better, but when he is slow and deliberate, and the side of his mouth lifts up to show the sharp teeth, I think I feel, well, I don't know how. Last night I got up softly and stole to the door, for I really feared to disturb him. There was not any noise of moving, and no kind of cry at all, but there was a queer kind of dragging sound and a slow, heavy breathing. Oh, it was dreadful, waiting there in the dark and the silence, and fearing I did not know what. At last I took my courage à deux mains, and turning the handle as softly as I could, I opened the door a tiny bit. It was quite dark within. I could just see the outline of the windows, but in the darkness the sound of breathing, becoming more distinct, was appalling. As I listened, this continued, but there was no other sound. I pushed the door open all at once. I was afraid to open it slowly. I felt as if there might be some dreadful thing behind it ready to pounce out on me. Then I switched on the electric light and stepped into the room. I looked first at the bed. The sheets were all crumpled up so that I knew father had been in bed, but there was a great dark red patch in the center of the bed and spreading to the edge of it that made my heart stand still. As I was gazing at it, the sound of the breathing came across the room, and my eyes followed to it. There was father on his right side with the other arm under him, just as if his dead body had been thrown there all in a heap. The track of blood went across the room up to the bed, and there was a pool all around him which looked terribly red and glittering as I bent over to examine the outline of the high windows, shadows which had sentience. I even thought there was sound, a faint sound as of the mew of a cat, the rustle of drapery, and a metallic clink as of metal faintly touching metal. I sat as one entranced. At last I felt, as in nightmare, that this was sleep, and that in the passing of its portals all my will had gone. All at once my senses were full awake. A shriek rang in my ears. The room was filled suddenly with a blaze of light. There was the sound of pistol shots, 1, 2, and a haze of white smoke in the room. When my waking eyes regained their power, I could have shrieked with horror myself at what I saw before me. Chapter 4. The Second Attempt. The sight which met my eyes had the horror of a dream within a dream, with the certainty of reality added. The room was as I had seen it last, except that the shadowy look had gone in the glare of the many lights, and every article in it stood stark and solidly real. By the empty bed sat Nurse Kennedy, as my eyes had last seen her, sitting bolt upright in the armchair beside the bed. She had placed a pillow behind her so that her back might be erect, but her neck was fixed as that of one in a cataleptic trance. She was, to all intents and purposes, turned into stone. There was no special expression on her face, no fear, no horror, nothing such as might be expected of one in such a condition. Her open eyes showed neither wonder nor interest. She was simply a negative existence, warm, breathing, placid, but absolutely unconscious of the world around her. The bedclothes were disarranged, as though the patient had been drawn from under them without throwing them back. The corner of the upper sheet hung upon the floor. Close by it lay one of the bandages with which the doctor had dressed the wounded wrist. Another and another lay further along the floor, as though forming a clue to where the sick man now lay. This was almost exactly where he had been found on the previous night, under the great safe. Again, the left arm lay toward the safe. But there had been a new outrage. An attempt had been made to sever the arm close to the bangle which held the tiny key. A heavy cookery knife, one of the leaf-shaped knives which the Gurkhas and others of the hill tribes of India use with such effect, had been taken from its place on the wall, and with it the attempt had been made. It was manifest that just at the moment of striking, the blow had been arrested, for only the point of the knife and not the edge of the blade had struck the flesh. As it was, the outer side of the arm had been cut to the bone, and the blood was pouring out. In addition, the former wound in front of the arm had been cut or torn about terribly. One of the cuts seemed to jet out blood, as if with each pulsation of the heart. By the side of her father knelt Miss Trelawny, her white nightdress stained with the blood in which she knelt. In the middle of the room, Sergeant Daw, in his shirt and trousers and stocking feet, was putting fresh cartridges into his revolver in a dazed, mechanical kind of way. His eyes were red and heavy, and he seemed only half awake and less than half conscious of what was going on around him. Several servants, bearing lights of various kinds, were clustered round the doorway. As I rose from my chair and came forward, Miss Trelawny raised her eyes toward me. When she saw me, she shrieked and started to her feet, pointing towards me. Never shall I forget the strange picture she made, with her white drapery all smeared with blood which, as she rose from the pool, ran in streaks toward her bare feet. I believed that I had only been asleep, that whatever influence had worked on Mr. Trelawny and Nurse Kennedy, and In less degree on Sergeant Daw had not touched me. The respirator had been of some service, though it had not kept off the tragedy whose dire evidences were before me. I can understand now, I could understand even then the fright, added to that which had gone before, which my appearance must have evoked. I had still on a respirator which covered mouth and nose. My hair had been tossed in my sleep, coming suddenly forward, thus enwrapped and disheveled. In that horrified crowd I must have had, in this strange mixture of lights, an extraordinary and terrifying appearance. It was well that I recognized all this in time to avert another catastrophe, for the half-dazed, mechanically acting detective put in the cartridges and had raised his revolver to shoot at me when I succeeded in wrenching off the respirator and shouting to him to hold his hand. In this, also, he acted mechanically. The red, half-awake eyes had not in them even then the intention of conscious action. The danger, however, was averted. The relief of the situation, strangely enough, came in a simple fashion. Mrs. Grant, seeing that her young mistress had on only her nightdress, had gone to fetch a dressing gown, which she now threw over her. This simple act brought us all back to the region of fact. With a long breath, one and all seemed to devote themselves to the most pressing matter before us, that of staunching the flow of blood from the arm of the wounded man. Even as the thought of action came, I rejoiced, for the bleeding was very proof that Mr. Trelawny still lived. Last night's lesson was not thrown away. More than one of those present knew now what to do in such an emergency, and, within a few seconds, willing hands were at work on a tourniquet. A man was at once dispatched for the doctor, and several of the servants disappeared to make themselves respectable. We lifted Mr. Trelawny onto the sofa where he had lain yesterday, and, having done what we could for him, turned our attention to the nurse. In all the turmoil she had not stirred. She sat there as before, erect and rigid, breathing softly and naturally, and with a placid smile, as it was manifestly of no use to attempt anything with her till the doctor had come. We began to think of the general situation. Mrs. Grant had by this time taken her mistress away and changed her clothes, for she was back presently in a dressing gown and slippers and with the traces of blood removed from her hands. She was now much calmer, though she trembled sadly, and her face was ghastly white. When she had looked at her father's wrist, I holding the tourniquet, she turned her eyes round the room, resting them now and again on each one of us present, in turn, but seeming to find no comfort. It was so apparent to me that she did not know where to begin or whom to trust that, to reassure her, I said, "I am all right now. I was only asleep." Her voice had a gulp in it as she said, in a low voice, "Asleep? You? And my father in danger? I thought you were on the watch." I felt the sting of justice in the reproach, but I really wanted to help her, so I answered, "Only asleep. It is bad enough, I know, but there is something more than an only round us here. Had it not been that I took a definite precaution, I might have been like the nurse there." She turned her eyes swiftly on the weird figure, sitting grimly upright like a painted statue, and then her face softened. With the action of habitual courtesy, she said, "Forgive me. I did not mean to be rude, but I am in such distress and fear that I hardly know what I am saying. Oh, it is dreadful. I fear for fresh trouble, and horror and mystery every moment." This cut me to the very heart, and out of the heart's fullness I spoke. "Don't give me a thought. I don't deserve it. I was on guard, and yet I slept. All that I can say is that I didn't mean to, and I tried to avoid it, but it was over me before I knew it. Anyhow, it is done now, and can't be undone. Probably some day we may understand it all, but now let us try to get at some idea of what has happened. Tell me what you remember." The effort to recollect seemed to stimulate her. She became calmer as she spoke. "I was asleep, and woke suddenly with the same horrible feeling on me that Father was in great and immediate danger. I jumped up and ran just as I was into his room. It was nearly pitch dark, but as I opened the door there was light enough to see Father's nightdress as he lay on the floor under the safe, just as on that first awful night. Then I think I must have gone mad for a moment. She stopped and shuddered. Suddenly, I have arranged to stay here tonight because I want to have a talk with you. And as I wish it to be quite private, I thought the least suspicious way would be to have a cigar together late in the evening when Miss Trelawny is watching her father. We still kept to our arrangement that either the sick man's daughter or I should be on watch all night. We were to share the duty. At the early hours of the morning, I was anxious about this, for I knew from our conversation that the detective would watch in secret himself, and would be particularly alert about that time. The day passed uneventfully. Miss Trelawny slept in the afternoon, and after dinner went to relieve the nurse. Mrs. Grant remained with her sergeant, daubing on duty in the corridor. Dr. Winchester and I took our coffee in the library. When we had lit our cigars, he said quietly, "Now that we are alone, I want to have a confidential talk. We are tired, of course, for the present at all events." "Quite so," I said, my heart sinking as I thought of my conversation with Sergeant Daw in the morning and of the disturbing and harrowing fears which it had left in my mind. He went on, "This case is enough to try the sanity of all of us concerned in it. The more I think of it, the madder I seem to get, and the two lines, each continually strengthened, seem to pull harder in opposite directions." "What two lines?" He looked at me keenly for a moment before replying. Dr. Winchester's look at such moments was apt to be disconcerting. It would have been so to me had I had a personal part, other than my interest, in Miss Trelawny, in the matter. As it was, however, I stood it unruffled. I was now an attorney in the case, an amicus curiae in one sense, in another, retained for the defense. The mere thought that in this clever man's mind were two lines, equally strong and opposite, was in itself so consoling as to neutralize my anxiety as to a new attack. As he began to speak, the doctor's face wore an inscrutable smile. This, however, gave place to a stern gravity. As he proceeded, two lines, fact and fancy. In the first there is this whole thing, attacks, attempts at robbery and murder, stupefyings, organized catalepsy which points to either criminal hypnotism and thought suggestion or some simple form of poisoning unclassified yet in our toxicology. In the other there is some influence at work which is not classified in any book that I know, outside the pages of romance. I never felt in my life so strongly the truth of Hamlet's words, "There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy." Let us take the fact side first. Here we have a man in his home, amidst his own household, plenty of servants of different classes in the house, which forbids the possibility of an organized attempt made from the servants' hall. He is wealthy, learned, clever. From his physiognomy, there is no doubting that he is a man of iron will and determined purpose. His daughter, his only child, I take it a young girl bright and clever, is sleeping in the very next room to his. There is seemingly no possible reason for expecting any attack or disturbance of any kind, and no reasonable opportunity for any outsider to effect it. And yet we have an attack made, a brutal and remorseless attack made in the middle of the night. Discovery is made quickly, made with that rapidity which in criminal cases generally is found to be not accidental, but of premeditated intent. The attacker or attackers are manifestly disturbed before the completion of their work, whatever their ultimate intent may have been, and yet there is no possible sign of their escape, no clue, no disturbance of anything, no open door or window, no sound, nothing whatever to show who had done the deed, or even that a deed has been done, except the victim and his surroundings incidental to the deed. The next night a similar attempt is made, though the house is full of wakeful people, and though there are on watch in the room and around it a detective officer, a trained nurse, an earnest friend, and the man's own daughter. The nurse is thrown into a catalepsy and the watching friend, though protected by a respirator, into a deep sleep. Even the detective is so far overcome with some phase of stupor that he fires off his pistol in the sick room and can't even tell what he thought he was firing at. That respirator of yours is the only thing that seems to have a bearing on the fact side of the affair, that you did not lose your head as the others did. The effect in such case being in proportion to the amount of time each remained in the room, points to the probability that the stupefying medium was not hypnotic, whatever else it may have been. But again, there is a fact which is contradictory. Miss Trelawny, who was in the room more than any of you, for she was in and out all the time and did her share of permanent watching also, did not seem to be affected at all. This would show that the influence, whatever it is, does not affect generally unless, of course, it was that she was in some way inured to it. If it should turn out that it be some strange exhalation from some of those Egyptian curios, that might account for it. Only, we are then face to face with the fact that Mr. Trelawny, who was most of all in the room, who, in fact, lived more than half his life in it, was affected worst of all. What kind of influence could it be which would account for all these different and contradictory effects? No. The more I think of this form of the dilemma, the more I am bewildered. Why, even if it were that the attack, the physical attack on Mr. Trelawny, had been made by someone residing in the house and not within the sphere of suspicion, the oddness of the stupefyings would still remain a mystery. It is not easy to put anyone into a catalepsy. Indeed, so far as is known yet in science, there is no way to achieve such an object at will. The crux of the whole matter is Miss Trelawny, who seems to be subject to none of the influences or possibly of the variants of the same influence at work. Through all she goes unscathed, except for that one slight semi-faint. It is most strange. I listened with a sinking heart, for, though his manner was not illuminative of distrust, his argument was disturbing. Although it was not so direct as the suspicion of the detective, it seemed to single out Miss Trelawny as different from all others concerned, and in a mystery to be alone is to be suspected, ultimately, if not immediately. I thought it better not to say anything. In such a case silence is indeed golden, and if I said nothing now I might have less to defend, or explain, or take back later. I was, therefore, secretly glad that his form of putting his argument did not require any answer from me for the present, at all events. Dr. Winchester did not seem to expect any answer, a fact which, when I recognized it, gave my pleasure. I hardly knew why. He paused for a while, sitting with his chin in his hand, his eyes staring at vacancy, whilst his brows were fixed. His cigar was held limp between his fingers. He had apparently forgotten it. In an even voice, as though commencing exactly where he had left off, he resumed his argument. The other horn of the dilemma is a different affair altogether, and if we once enter on it, we must leave everything in the shape of science and experience behind us. I confess that it has its fascinations for me, though at every new thought I find myself romancing in a way that makes me pull up suddenly and look facts resolutely in the face. I sometimes wonder whether the influence or emanation from the sick room at times affects me as it did the others, the detective, for instance. Of course it may be that if it is anything chemical, any drug, for example, in vaporeal form, its effects may be cumulative. But then, what could there be that could produce such an effect? The room is, I know, full of mummy smell, and no wonder, with so many relics from the tomb, let alone the actual mummy of that animal which Silvio attacked. By the way, I am going to test him tomorrow. I have been on the trace of a mummy cat, and am to get possession of it in the morning. When I bring it here, we shall find out if it be a fact that racial instinct can survive a few thousand years in the grave. However, to get back to the subject in hand, these very mummy smells arise from the presence of substances and combinations of substances, which the Egyptian priests, who were the learned men and scientists of their time, found by the experience of centuries to be strong enough to arrest the natural forces of decay. There must be powerful agencies at work to effect such a purpose, and it is possible that we may have here some rare substance or combination whose qualities and powers are not understood in this later and more prosaic age. I wonder if Mr. Trelawny has any knowledge or even suspicion of such a kind? I only know this for certain, that a worse atmosphere for a sick chamber could not possibly be imagined, and I admire the courage of Sir James Frere in refusing to have anything to do with the case under such conditions. These instructions of Mr. Trelawny to his daughter, and from what you have told me, the care with which he has protected his wishes through his solicitor, show that he suspected something at any rate. Indeed, it would almost seem as if he expected something to happen. I wonder if it would be possible to learn anything about that. Surely his papers would show or suggest something. It is a difficult matter to tackle, but it might have to be done. His present condition can the least annoyance. He took no notice of it whatever. He stood on the table close beside it, purring loudly. Then, following out his plan, the doctor brought him into Mr. Trelawny's room, we all following. Dr. Winchester was excited, Miss Trelawny anxious. I was more than interested myself, for I began to have a glimmering of the doctor's idea. The detective was calmly and coldly superior, but Mr. Corbeck, who was an enthusiast, was full of eager curiosity. The moment Dr. Winchester got into the room, Silvio began to mew and wriggle, and jumping out of his arms, ran over to the cat mummy and began to scratch angrily at it. Miss Trelawny had some difficulty in taking him away, but so soon as he was out of the room, he became quiet. When she came back, there was a clamor of comments. "I thought so," from the doctor. "What can it mean?" from Miss Trelawny. "That's a very strange thing," from Mr. Corbeck. "Oh, but it doesn't prove anything," from the detective. "I suspend my judgment," from myself, thinking it advisable to say something. Then, by common consent, we dropped the theme for the present. In my room that evening I was making some notes of what had happened when there came a low tap on the door. In obedience to my summons, Sergeant Daw came in, carefully closing the door behind him. "Well, Sergeant," said I, "sit down." "What is it?" "I wanted to speak to you, sir, about those lamps." I nodded and waited. He went on. "You know that room where they were found opens directly into the room where Miss Trelawny slept last night?" "Yes." "During the night, a window somewhere in that part of the house was opened and shut again. I heard it and took a look round, but I could see no sign of anything." "Yes, I know that," I said. "I heard a window moved myself." "Does nothing strike you as strange about it, sir?" "Strange?" I said. "Strange? Why, it's all the most bewildering, maddening thing I have ever encountered. It is all so strange that one seems to wonder, and simply waits for what will happen next." "But what do you mean by strange?" The detective paused, as if choosing his words to begin, and then said, deliberately, "You see, I am not one who believes in magic and such things. I am for facts, all the time, and I always find in the long run that there is a reason and a cause for everything. This new gentleman says these things were stolen out of his room in the hotel. The lamps, I take it from some things he has said, really belong to Mr. Trelawny. His daughter, the lady of the house, having left the room she usually occupies, sleeps that night on the ground floor. A window is heard to open and shut during the night. When we, who have been during the day trying to find a clue to the robbery, come to the house, we find the stolen goods in a room close to where she slept, and opening out of it." He stopped. I felt that same sense of pain and apprehension which I had experienced when he had spoken to me before, creeping or rather rushing over me again. I had to face the matter out, however. My relations with her, and the feeling toward her which I now knew full well meant a very deep love and devotion, demanded so much. I said as calmly as I could, for I knew the keen eyes of the skillful investigator were on me. And the inference? He answered with the cool audacity of conviction. The inference to me is that there was no robbery at all. The goods were taken by someone to this house, where they were received through a window on the ground floor. They were placed in the cabinet, ready to be discovered when the proper time should come. Somehow I felt relieved. The assumption was too monstrous. I did not want, however, my relief to be apparent, so I answered as gravely as I could. And who do you suppose brought them to the house? I keep my mind open as to that. Possibly Mr. Corbeck himself. The matter might be too risky to trust to a third party. Then the natural extension of your inference is that Mr. Corbeck is a liar and a fraud, and that he is in conspiracy with Miss Trelawny to deceive someone or other about those lamps. Those are harsh words, Mr. Ross. They're so plain-spoken that they bring a man upstanding and make new doubts for him. But I have to go where my reason points. It may be that there is another party than Miss Trelawny in it. Indeed, if it hadn't been for the other matter that set me thinking and bred doubts of its own about her, I wouldn't dream of mixing her up in this. But I'm safe on Corbeck. Whoever else is in it, he is. The things couldn't have been taken without his connivance, if what he says is true. If it isn't, well, he is a liar anyhow. I would think it a bad job to have him stay in a house with so many valuables, only that it will give me and my maid a chance of watching him. We'll keep a pretty good lookout, too, I tell you. He's up in my room now, guarding those lamps, but Johnny Wright is there too. I go on before he comes off, so there won't be much chance of another housebreaking. Of course, Mr. Ross, all this, too, is between you and me. Quite so. You may depend on my silence, I said, and he went away to keep a close eye on the Egyptologist. It seemed as though all my painful experiences were to go in pairs, and that the sequence of the previous day was to be repeated, for before long I had another private visit from Dr. Winchester, who had now paid his nightly visit to his patient and was on his way home. He took the seat which I proffered and began at once. This is a strange affair altogether. Miss Trelawny has just been telling me about the stolen lamps and of the finding of them in the Napoleon cabinet. It would seem to be another complication of the mystery, and yet, do you know, it is a relief to me. I have exhausted all human and natural possibilities of the case, and am beginning to fall back on superhuman and supernatural possibilities. Here are such strange things that if I am not going mad, I think we must have a solution before long. I wonder if I might ask some questions and some help from Mr. Corbeck without making further complications and embarrassing us. He seems to know an amazing amount regarding Egypt and all relating to it. Perhaps he wouldn't mind translating a little bit of hieroglyphic. It is child's play to him. What do you think? When I had thought the matter over a few seconds, I spoke. We wanted all the help we could get. For myself, I had perfect confidence in both men, and any comparing notes or mutual assistance might bring good results. Such could hardly bring evil. By all means I should ask him. He seems an extraordinarily learned man in Egyptology, and he seems to me a good fellow as well as an enthusiast. By the way, it will be necessary to be a little guarded as to whom you speak, regarding any information which he may give you. Of course, he answered. Indeed, I should not dream of saying anything to anybody, excepting yourself. We have to remember that when Mr. Trelawny recovers, he may not like to think that we have been chattering unduly over his affairs. Look here, I said, why not stay for a while, and I shall ask him to come and have a pipe with us. We can then talk over things. He acquiesced, So I went to the room where Mr. Corbeck was and brought him back with me. I thought the detectives were pleased at his going on the way to my room, he said. I don't half like leaving those things there, with only those men to guard them. They're a deal sight too precious to be left to the police. From which it would appear that suspicion was not confined to Sergeant Mr. Corbeck and Dr. Winchester, after a quick glance at each other, became at once on most friendly terms. The traveler professed his willingness to be of any assistance which he could, provided, he added, that it was anything about which he was free to speak. This was not very promising, but Dr. Winchester began at once. I want you, if you will, to translate some hieroglyphic for me. Certainly, with the greatest pleasure, so far as I can. For I may tell you that hieroglyphic writing is not quite mastered yet, though we are getting at it. We are getting at it. What is the inscription? There are two, he answered. One of them I shall bring here. He went out and returned in a minute with the mummy cat which he had that evening introduced to Silvio. The scholar took it, and, after short examination, said, "There is nothing especial in this. It is an appeal to Bast, the lady of Bubastis, to give her good bread and milk in the Elysian fields. There may be more inside, and if you will care to unroll it, I will do my best. I do not think, however, that there is anything special. From the method of wrapping I should say it is from the Delta, and of a late period when such mummy work was common and cheap. What is the other inscription you wish me to see?" "The inscription on the mummy cat in Mr. Trelawny's room." Mr. Corbeck's face fell. "No," he said, "I cannot do that. I am, for the present, at all events, practically bound to secrecy regarding any of the things in Mr. Trelawny's room." Dr. Winchester's comment and my own were made at the same moment. I said only the one word, checkmate, from which I think he may have gathered that I guessed more of his idea and purpose than perhaps I had intentionally conveyed to him. He murmured, "Practically bound to secrecy?" Mr. Corbeck at once took up the challenge conveyed. "Do not misunderstand me. I am not bound by any definite pledge of secrecy, but I am bound in honor to respect Mr. Trelawny's confidence, given to me, I may tell you, in a very large measure. Regarding many of the objects in his room, he has a definite purpose in view, and it would not be either right or becoming for me, his trusted friend and confidant, to forestall that purpose. Mr. Trelawny, you may know, or rather you do not know, or you would not have so construed my remark, is a scholar of very great scholar. He has worked for years toward a certain end. For this he has spared no labor, no expense, no personal danger or self-denial. He is on the line of a result which will place him amongst the foremost discoverers or investigators of his age. And now, just at the time when any hour might bring him success, he is stricken down." He stopped, seemingly overcome with emotion. After a time, he recovered himself and went on. "Again, do not misunderstand me as to another point. I have said that Mr. Trelawny has made much confidence with me, but I do not mean to lead you to believe that I know all his plans, or his aims or objects. I know the period which he has been studying and the definite historical individual whose life he has been investigating and whose records he has been following up one by one with infinite patience. But beyond this I know nothing. That he has some aim or object in the completion of this knowledge, I am convinced. What it is I may guess, but I must say nothing. Please to remember, gentlemen, that I have voluntarily accepted the position of recipient of a partial confidence. I have respected that, and I must ask any of my friends to do the same." He spoke with great dignity, and he grew, moment by moment, in the respect and esteem of both Dr. Winchester and myself. We understood that he had not done speaking, so we waited in silence till he continued. "I have spoken this much, although I know well that even such a hint as either of you might gather from my words might jeopardize the success of his work. But I am convinced that you both wish to help him and his daughter. He said this looking me fairly between the eyes, to the best of your power, honestly and unselfishly. He is so stricken down, and the manner of it is so mysterious that I cannot but think that it is in some way a result of his own work. That he calculated on some setback is manifest to us all. God knows. I am willing to do what I can, and to use any knowledge I have in his behalf. I arrived in England full of exultation at the thought that I had fulfilled the mission with which he had trusted me. I had got what he said were the last objects of his search, and I felt assured that he would now be able to begin the experiment of which he had often hinted to me. It is too dreadful that at just such a time such a calamity should have fallen on him. Dr. Winchester, you are a physician, and if your face does not belie you are a clever and a bold one. Is there no way which you can devise to wake this man from his unnatural stupor? There was a pause. Then the answer came slowly and deliberately. There is no ordinary remedy that I know of. There might possibly be some extraordinary one, but there would be no use in trying to find it except on one condition, and that knowledge. I am completely ignorant of Egyptian matters, language, writing, history, secrets, medicines, poisons, occult powers, all that go to make up the mystery of that mysterious land. This disease, or condition, or whatever it may be called, from which Mr. Trelawny is suffering, is in some way connected with Egypt. I have had a suspicion of this from the first, and later it grew into a certainty, though without proof. What you have said tonight confirms my conjecture, and makes me believe that a proof is to be had. I do not think that you quite know all that has gone on in this house since the night of the attack, of the finding of Mr. Trelawny's body. Now I propose that we confide in you. If Mr. Ross agrees, I shall ask him to tell you. He is more skilled than I am in putting facts before other people. He can speak by his brief, and in this case he has the best of all briefs, the experience of his own eyes and ears, and the evidence that he has himself taken on the spot from participators in or spectators of what has happened. When you know all, you will, I hope, be in a position to judge as to whether you can best help Mr. Trelawny and further his secret wishes by your silence or your speech. I nodded approval. Mr. Corbeck jumped up and, in his impulsive way, held out a hand to each. Done, he said. I acknowledge the honor of your confidence, and on my part one pledge myself that if I find my duty to Mr. Trelawny's wishes will, in his own interest, allow my lips to open on his affairs, I shall speak so freely as I may. Accordingly I began and told him, as exactly as I could, everything that had happened from the moment of my waking at the knocking on the door in Jermyn Street. The only reservations I made were as to my own feeling toward Miss Trelawny, and the matters of small import to the main subject which followed it, and my conversations with Sergeant Daw, which were in themselves private, and which would have demanded discretionary silence. In any case, as I spoke, Mr. Corbeck followed with breathless interest. Sometimes he would stand up and pace about the room in uncontrollable excitement, and then recover himself suddenly and sit down again. Sometimes he would be about to speak, but would, with an effort, restrain himself. I think the narration helped me to make up my own mind, for even as I talked, things seemed to appear in a clearer light. Things big and little in relation of their importance to the case fell into proper perspective. The story up to date became coherent, except as to its cause, which seemed a greater mystery than ever. This is the merit of entire or collected narrative. Isolated facts, doubts, suspicions, conjectures give way to a homogeneity, which is convincing. That Mr. Corbeck was convinced was evident. He did not go through any process of explanation or limitation, but spoke right out at once to the point, and fearlessly like a man. That settles me. There is an activity, some force that needs special care.
If
We all go on working in the dark, we shall get in one another's way, and by hampering each other, undo the good that any or each of us, working in different directions, might do. It seems to me that the first thing we have to accomplish is to get Mr. Trelawney waked out of that unnatural sleep.
that
He can be waked is apparent from the way the nurse has recovered, though what additional harm may have been done to him in the time he has been lying in that room, I suppose no one can tell. We must chance that, however. He has lain there, and whatever the effect might be, it is there now, and we have and shall have to deal with it as a fact. A day more or less won't hurt. In the long run, it is late now, and we shall probably have tomorrow a task before us that will require our energies afresh. You, doctor, will want to get to your sleep, for I suppose you have other work as well as this to do tomorrow. As for you, Mr. Ross, I understand that you are to have a spell of watching in the sick room tonight. I shall get you a book which will help to
pass the time for you.
I shall go and look for it in the library. I know where it was when I was here last, and I don't suppose Mr. Trelawney has used it
Since
he knew long ago all that was in it which was or might be of interest
to him.
But it will be necessary, or at least helpful, to understand other things which I shall tell you later. You will be able to tell Dr. Winchester all that would aid him, for I take it that our work will branch out pretty soon. We shall each have our own end to hold up, and it will take each of us all our time and understanding to get through his own tasks. It will not be necessary for you to read the whole book, all that will interest you with regard to our matter. I mean, of course, for the whole book is interesting as a record of travel in a country then quite unknown, is the preface, and 2 or 3 chapters which I shall mark for you. He shook hands warmly with Dr. Winchester, who had stood up to go. Whilst he was away, I sat lonely, thinking. As I thought, the world around me seemed to be illimitably great. The only little spot in which I was interested seemed like a tiny speck in the midst of a wilderness. Without and around it were darkness and unknown danger pressing in from every side. And the central figure in our little oasis was one of sweetness and beauty, a figure one could love, could work for, could die for. Mr. Corbett came back in a very short time with the book. He had found it at once in the spot where he had seen it 3 years before, having placed in it several slips of paper, marking the places where I was to read. He put it into my hands, saying, "That is what started Mr. Trelawney, what started me when I read it, and which will, I have no doubt, be to you an interesting beginning to a special study, whatever the end may be. If, indeed, any of us here may ever see the end." At the door he paused and said, "I want to take back one thing. That detective is a good fellow. What you have told me of him puts him in a new light. The best proof of it is that I can go quietly to sleep tonight and leave the lamps in his care." When he had gone, I took the book with me, put on my respirator, and went to my spell of duty in the sick room. Chapter 10. The Valley of the Sorcerer. I placed the book on the little table on which the shaded lamp rested and moved the screen to one side. Thus I could have the light on my book and, by looking up, see the bed and the nurse and the door. I cannot say that the conditions were enjoyable or calculated to allow of that absorption in the subject which is advisable for effective study. However, I composed myself to the work as well as I could. The book was one which, on the very face of it, required special attention. It was a folio in Dutch, printed in
Amsterdam in 1650.
Someone had made a literal translation, writing generally the English word under the Dutch, so that the grammatical differences between the two tongues made even the reading of the translation a difficult matter. One had to dodge backward and forward among the words. This was in addition to the difficulty of deciphering a strange handwriting of 200 years ago. I found, however, that after a short time I got into the habit of following in conventional English, the Dutch construction, And as I became more familiar with the writing, my task became easier. At first, the circumstances of the room and the fear lest Miss Trelawny should return unexpectedly and find me reading the book disturbed me somewhat, for we had arranged amongst us, before Dr. Winchester had gone home, that she was not to be brought into the range of the coming investigation. We considered that there might be some shock to a woman's mind in matters of apparent mystery, and further, that she, being Mr., become astral at command and so move particle by particle and become whole again when and where required. Then there was a piece of writing in which allusion was made to a chest or casket in which were contained all the gods and will and sleep, the two latter being personified by symbols. The box was mentioned as with 7 sides. It was not much of a surprise to us when, underneath the feet of the mummy, we found the 7-sided casket, which you have also seen in Mr. Trelawny's room.
On
the underneath part of the wrapping linen of the left foot was painted in the same vermilion color as that used in the stele, the hieroglyphic symbol for much water, and underneath the right foot the symbol of the earth. We made out the symbolism to be that her body, immortal and transferable at will, ruled both the land and water, air and fire, the latter being exemplified by the light of the jewel stone, and further by the flint and iron which lay outside the mummy wrappings. As we lifted the casket from the sarcophagus, we noticed on its sides the strange protuberances which you have already seen, but we were unable at the time to account for them. There were a few amulets in the sarcophagus, but none of any special worth or significance. We took it that if there were such, they were within the wrappings, or more probably in the strange casket underneath the mummy's feet. This, however, we could not open. There were signs of there being a cover, certainly the upper portion and the lower were each in one piece. The fine line a little way from the top appeared to be where the cover was fixed, but it was made with such exquisite fineness and finish that the joining could hardly be seen.
certainly.
The top could not be moved. We took it that it was in some way fastened from within. I tell you all this in order that you may understand things with which you may be in contact later. You must suspend your judgment entirely. Such strange things have happened regarding this mummy and all around it that there is a necessity for new belief somewhere. It is absolutely impossible to reconcile certain things which have happened with the ordinary currents of life or knowledge. We stayed around the Valley of the Sorcerer till we had copied roughly all the drawings and writings on the walls, ceiling, and floor. We took with us the stele of lapis lazuli, whose graven record was colored with vermilion
Pigment.
We took the sarcophagus and the mummy, the stone chest with the alabaster jars, the tables of bloodstone and alabaster and onyx and carnelian, and the ivory pillow whose arch rested on buckles, round each of which was twisted and uraeus wrought in gold. We took all the articles which lay in the chapel and the mummy pit, the wooden boats with crews and the Ashaptia figures and the symbolic amulets. When coming away, we took down the ladders and at a distance buried them in the sand under a cliff, which we noted, so that if necessary we might find them again. Then, with our heavy baggage, we set out on our laborious journey back to the Nile. It was no easy task, I tell you, to bring the case with that great sarcophagus over the desert. We had a rough cart and sufficient men to draw it, but the progress seemed terribly slow, for we were anxious to get our treasures into a place of safety. The night was an anxious time with us, for we feared attack from some marauding band. But more still we feared some of those with us. They were, after all, but predatory, unscrupulous men, and we had with us a considerable bulk of precious
Things.
They, or at least the dangerous ones amongst them, did not know why it was so precious. They took it for granted that it was material treasure of some kind that we carried. We had taken the mummy from the sarcophagus and packed it for safety of travel in a separate case. During the First night, 2 attempts were made to steal things from the cart, and 2 men were found dead in the morning. On the second night, there came on a violent storm, one of those terrible simoons of the desert which makes one feel his helplessness. We were overwhelmed with drifting sand. Some of our Bedouins had fled before the storm, hoping to find shelter. The rest of us, wrapped in our boreness, endured with what patience we could. In the morning, when the storm had passed, we recovered from under the piles of sand what we could of our impedimenta. We found the case in which the mummy had been packed all broken, but the mummy itself could nowhere be found. We searched everywhere around and dug up the sand which had piled around us, but in
vain.
We did not know what to do, for Trelawny had his heart set on taking home that mummy. We waited a whole day in hopes that the Bedouins, who had fled, would return. We had a blind hope that they might have in some way removed the mummy from the cart and would restore it. That night, just before dawn, Mr. Trelawny woke me up and whispered in my ear, "We must go back to the tomb in the Valley of the Sorcerer. Show no hesitation in the morning when I give the orders. If you ask any questions as to where we are going, it will create suspicion and will defeat our purpose." "All right," I answered. "But why shall we go there?" His answer seemed to thrill through me as though it had struck some chord ready tuned within. "We shall find the mummy there. I am sure of it." Then, anticipating doubt or argument, he added, "Wait, and you shall see." And he sank back into his blanket again. The Arabs were surprised when we retraced our steps, and some of them were not satisfied. There was a good deal of friction, and there were several desertions, so that it was with a diminished following that we took our way eastward again. At first, the sheik did not manifest any curiosity as to our definite destination, but when it became apparent that we were again making for the Valley of the Sorcerer, he too showed concern. This grew as we drew near, till finally at the entrance of the valley he halted and refused to go further. He said he would await our return if we chose to go on alone, that he would wait 3 days, but if by that time we had not returned, he would leave. No offer of money would tempt him to depart from this resolution. The only concession he would make was that he would find the ladders and bring them near the cliff. This he did, and then with the rest of the troop, he went back to wait at the entrance of the valley. Mr. Trelawny and I took ropes and torches, and again ascended to the
tomb.
It was evident that someone had been there in our absence, for the stone slab which protected the entrance to the tomb was lying flat inside, and a rope was dangling from the cliff summit. Within there was another rope hanging into the shaft of the mummy pit. We looked at each other, but neither said a word. We fixed our own rope, and as arranged, Trelawny descended first, I following at once.
It was not till we stood together at the
foot of the shaft that the thought flashed across me that we might be in some sort of a trap, that someone might descend the rope from the cliff, and by cutting the rope by which we had lowered ourselves into the pit, bury us there alive. The thought was horrifying, but it was too late to do anything. I remained silent. We both had torches so that there was ample light as we passed through the passage and entered the chamber where the sarcophagus had stood. The first thing noticeable was the emptiness of the
place.
Despite all its magnificent adornment, the tomb was made a desolation by the absence of the great sarcophagus, to hold which it was hewn in the rock, of the chest with the alabaster jars, of the tables which had held the implements and food for the use of the dead, and the ashaptiu figures. It was made more infinitely desolate still by the shrouded figure of the mummy of Queen Tera, which lay on the floor where the great sarcophagus had stood. Beside it lay, in the strange contorted attitudes of violent death, 3 of the Arabs who had deserted from our party. Their faces were black, and their hands and necks were smeared with blood which had burst from mouth and nose and eyes. On the throat of each were the marks, now blackening, of a hand of 7 fingers. Trelawny and I drew close, and clutched each other in awe and fear as we looked. For, most wonderful of all, across the breast of the mummied queen lay a hand of 7 fingers, ivory white, the wrist only showing a scar like a jagged red line, from which seemed to depend drops of blood. Chapter 12. The Magic Coffer. When we recovered our amazement, which seemed to last unduly long, we did not lose any time carrying the mummy through the passage and hoisting it up the pit shaft. I went first to receive it at the top. As I looked down, I saw Mr. Trelawny lift the severed hand and put it in his breast, manifestly to save it from being injured or lost. We left the dead Arabs where they lay. With our ropes, we lowered our precious burden to the ground, and then took it to the entrance of the valley where our escort was to wait. To our astonishment, we found them on the move. When we remonstrated with the sheik, he answered that he had fulfilled his contract. To the letter, he had waited the 3 days as arranged. I thought that he was lying to cover up his base intention of deserting us, and I found when we compared notes that Trelawny had the same suspicion.
It was not till we
arrived at Cairo that we found he was correct. It was the 3rd of November, 1884, when we entered the mummy pit for the second time. We had reason to remember the date. We had lost 3 whole days of our reckoning out of our lives whilst we had stood wondering in that chamber of the dead. Was it strange, then, that we had a superstitious feeling with regard to the dead Queen Tera and all belonging to her? Is it any wonder that it rests with us now with a bewildering sense of some power outside ourselves or our comprehension? Will it be any wonder if it go down to the grave with us at the appointed time? If, indeed, there be any graves for us who have robbed the dead.
He
was silent for quite a minute before he went on. We got to Cairo all right, and from there to Alexandria, where we were to take ship by the messagerie service to Marseilles, and go thence by express to London.
But
the best laid schemes, oh, mice and men gang aft eagerly. At Alexandria, Trelawny found waiting a cable stating that Mrs. Trelawny had died in giving birth to a daughter. Her stricken husband hurried off at once by the Orient Express, and I had to bring the treasure alone to the desolate house. I got to London all safe. There seemed to be some special good fortune to our journey. When I got to this house, the funeral had long been over. The child had been put out to nurse, and Mr. Trelawny had so far recovered from the shock of his loss that he had set himself to take up again the broken threads of his life and his work. That he had had a shock, and a bad one, was apparent.
the sudden
Gray in his black hair was proof enough in itself, but in addition, the strong cast of his features had become set and stern since he received that cable. In the shipping office at Alexandria, I have never seen a happy smile on his
face.
Work is the best thing in such a case, and to his work he devoted himself, heart and soul. The strange tragedy of his loss and gain, for the child was born after the mother's death, took place during the time that we stood in that trance in the mummy pit of Queen Tera. It seemed to have become in some way associated with his Egyptian studies, and more especially with the mysteries connected with the queen. He told me very little about his daughter, but that 2 forces struggled in his mind regarding her was apparent. I could see that he loved, almost idolized her, yet he could never forget that her birth had cost her mother's life. Also, there was something whose existence seemed to wring his father's heart, though he would never tell me what it was. Again, he once said in a moment of relaxation of his purpose of silence, "She is unlike her mother, but in both feature and color she is a marvelous resemblance to the pictures of Queen Tera." He said that he had sent her away to people who would care for her as he could not, and that till she became a woman she should have all the simple pleasures that a young girl might have, and that were best for her. I would often have talked with him about her, but he would never say much. Once, he said to me, "There are reasons why I should not speak more than is
necessary."
Someday you will know and understand. I respected his reticence, and beyond asking after her on my return after a journey, I have never spoken of her again. I had never seen her till I did so in your presence. Well, when the treasures which we had, taken from the tomb had been brought here, Mr. Trelawny arranged their disposition himself.
The
mummy, all except the severed hand, he placed in the great ironstone sarcophagus in the hall. This was wrought for the Theban high priest Uni, and is, as you may have remarked, all inscribed with wonderful invocations
to the old gods of Egypt.
The rest of the things from the tomb he disposed about his own room, as you have seen. Amongst them he placed, for special reasons of his own, the mummy hand. I think he regards this as the most sacred of his possessions, with perhaps one exception. That is the carven ruby which he calls the Jewel of 7 Stars, which he keeps in that great safe which is locked and guarded by various devices, as you know. I dare say you find this tedious, but I have had to explain it so that you should understand all up to the present. It was a long time after my return with the mummy of Queen Tera when Mr. Trelawny reopened the subject with me. He had been several times to Egypt, sometimes with me, and sometimes alone, and I had been several trips on my own account or for him. But in all that time, nearly 16 years, he never mentioned the subject, unless when some pressing occasion suggested, if it did not necessitate a reference. One morning early, he sent for me in a hurry. I was then studying in the British Museum and had rooms in Hart Street. When I came, he was all on fire with excitement. I had not seen him in such a glow since before the news of his wife's death. He took me at once into his room. The window blinds were down and the shutters closed. Not a ray of daylight came in.
The
ordinary lights in the room were not lit, but there were a lot of powerful electric lamps, 50 candle power at least, arranged on one side of the room. The little bloodstone table on which the heptagonal coffer stands was drawn to the center of the room. The coffer looked exquisite in the glare of light which shone on it. It actually seemed to glow as if lit in some way from within. What do you think of it? He asked. It is like a jewel, I answered. You may well call it the sorcerer's magic coffer, if it often looks like that. It almost seems to be alive. Do you know why it seems so? From the glare of the light, I suppose? Light, of course, he answered, but it is rather the disposition of light.
As
he spoke, he turned up the ordinary lights of the room and switched off the special ones. The effect on the stone box was surprising. In a second it lost all its glowing effect. It was still a very beautiful stone, as always, but it was stone and no more. Do you notice anything about the arrangement of the lamps? He asked.
No.
They were in the shape of the stars in the plough, as the stars are in the ruby. The statement came to me with a certain sense of conviction. I do not know why, except that there had been so many mysterious associations with the mummy and all belonging to it that any new one seemed enlightening. I listened as Trelawny went on to explain. For 16 years I have never ceased to think of that adventure, or to try to find a clue to the mysteries which came before us, but never until last night did I seem to find a solution. I think I must have dreamed of it, for I woke all on fire about it. I jumped out of bed with the determination of doing something before I quite knew what it was that I wished to do. Then all at once, the purpose was clear before me. There were allusions in the writing on the walls of the tomb to the 7 stars of the Great Bear that go to make up the plough, and the north was again and again emphasized.
The
same symbols were repeated with regard to the magic box, as we called
it.
We had already noticed those peculiar translucent spaces in the stone of the box. You remember the hieroglyphic writing had told that the jewel came from the heart of an aerolite and that the coffer was cut from it also. It might be, I thought, that the light of the 7 stars shining in the right direction might have some effect on the box or something within it.
I
raised the blind and looked out. The plough was high in the heavens, and both its stars and the pole star were straight opposite the window. I pulled the table with the coffer out into the light and shifted it until the translucent patches were in the direction of the stars. Instantly the box began to glow, as you saw it under the lamps, though but slightly. I waited and waited, but the sky clouded over, and the light died away. So I got wires and lamps. You know how often I used them in experiments and tried the effect of electric light. It took me some time to get the lamps properly placed so that they would correspond to the parts of the stone, but the moment I got them right, the whole thing began to glow as you have seen it. I could get no further, however. There was evidently something wanting. All at once it came to me that if light could have some effect, there should be in the tomb some means of producing light, for there could not be starlight in the mummy pit in the cavern. Then the whole thing seemed to become
clear.
On the bloodstone table, which has a hollow carved in its top, into which the bottom of the coffer fits, I laid the magic coffer, and I at once saw that the odd protuberances so carefully wrought in the substance of the stone corresponded in a way to the stars in the constellation. These, then, were to hold lights. Eureka! I cried. All we want now is the lamps. I tried placing the electric lights on or close to the protuberances, but the glow never came to the stone. So the conviction grew on me that there were special lamps made for the purpose. If we could find them, a step on the road to solving the mystery should be gained. But what about the lamps? I asked. Where are they? When are we to discover them? How are we to know them if we do find them? What? He stopped me at once. One thing at a time, he said quietly. Your first question contains all the
rest.
Where are these lamps? I shall tell you. In the tomb. In the tomb. I repeated in surprise. Why, you and I searched the place ourselves from end to end, and there was not a sign of a lamp, not a sign of anything remaining when we came away the first time, or on the second, except the bodies of the Arabs. Whilst I was speaking, he had uncoiled some large sheets of paper which he had brought in his hand from his own room. These he spread out on the great table, keeping their edges down with books and weights. I knew them. At a glance, they were the careful copies which he had made of our first transcripts from the writing in the tomb. When he had all ready, he turned to me and said slowly, Do you remember wondering, when we examined the tomb, at the lack of one thing which is usually found in such a tomb?
Yes. There was no serdab.
The serdab, I may perhaps explain, said Mr. Corbeck to me, is a sort of niche built or hewn in the wall of a tomb. Those which have, as yet, been examined bear no inscriptions, and contain only effigies of the dead for whom the tomb was made. Then he went on with his narrative. Trelawny, when he saw that I had caught his meaning, went on speaking with something of his old enthusiasm. I have come to the conclusion that there must be a serdab, a secret one. We were dull not to have thought of it before. We might have known that the maker of such a tomb, a woman who had shown in other ways such a sense of beauty and completeness, and who had finished every detail with a feminine richness of elaboration, would not have neglected such an architectural feature. Even if it had not its own special significance in ritual, she would have had it as an adornment. Others had had it, and she liked her own work to be complete. Depend upon it, there is a serdab, and that in it, when it is discovered, we shall find the lamps. Of course, had we known then what we now know, or at all events surmise, that there were lamps, we might have suspected some hidden spot, some cachet. I am going to ask you to go out to Egypt again, to seek the tomb, to find the serdab, and to bring back the lamps. And if I find there is no serdab, or if discovering it I find no lamps in it, what then? He smiled grimly with that saturnine smile of his, so rarely seen for years past, as he spoke slowly. Then you will have to hustle till you find them. Good, I said.
He pointed to one of the sheets.
Here are the transcripts from the chapel at the south and the east. I have been looking over the writings again, and I find that in 7 places round. This corner are the symbols of the constellation, which we call the plough, which Queen Tera held to rule her birth and her destiny. I have examined them carefully, and I notice that they are all representations of the grouping of the stars, as the constellation appears in different parts of the heavens. They are all astronomically correct, and as in the real sky, the pointers indicate the pole star, so these all point to one spot in the wall where usually the serdab is to be found. Hey! I shouted, for such a piece of reasoning demanded applause. He seemed pleased as he went on. When you are in the tomb, examine this spot. There is probably some spring or mechanical contrivance for opening the receptacle. What it may be, there is no use guessing. You will know what best to do when you are on the spot. I started the next week for Egypt, and never rested till I stood again in the
Tomb.
I had found some of our old following, and was fairly well provided with help. The country was now in a condition very different to that in which it had been 16 years before. There was no need for troops or armed men. I climbed the rock face alone. There was no difficulty, for in that fine climate the woodwork of the ladder was still dependable.
It was easy to see
that in the years that had elapsed there had been other visitors to the tomb, and my heart sank within me when I thought that some of them might by chance have come across the secret place. It would be a bitter discovery, indeed, to find that they had forestalled me, and that my journey had been in
vain.
The bitterness was realized when I lit my torches and passed between the 7-sided columns to the chapel of the tomb. There, in the very spot where I had expected to find it, was the opening of a serdab, and the serdab was empty. But the chapel was not empty, for the dried-up body of a man in Arab dress lay close under the opening, as though he had been stricken down.
I
examined all round the walls to see if Trelawny's surmise was correct, and I found that in all the positions of the stars as given, the pointers of the plough indicated a spot to the left hand, or south side, of the opening of the serdab, where was a single star in gold. I pressed this, and it gave way. The stone which had marked the front of the serdab, and which lay back against the wall within, moved slightly.
On
further examining the other side of the opening, I found a similar spot, indicated by other representations of the constellation, but this was itself a figure of the 7 stars, and each was wrought in burnished gold. I pressed each star in turn, but without result. Then it struck me that if the opening spring was on the left, this on the right might have been intended for the simultaneous pressure of all the stars by one hand of 7 fingers. By using both my hands, I managed to effect this. With a loud click, a metal figure seemed to dart from close to the opening of the serdab. The stone slowly swung back to its place and shut with a
click.
The glimpse which I had of the descending figure appalled me for the moment. It was like that grim guardian which, according to the Arabian historian Ibn Abd al-Hakim, the builder of the pyramids, King Sorid ibn Salhaq, placed in the western pyramid to defend its treasure. A marble figure, upright, with lance in hand, with on his head a serpent wreathed. When any approached, the serpent would bite him on one side and, twining about his throat and killing him, would return again to his place. I knew well that such a figure was not wrought to pleasantry, and that, too brave, it was no child's play. The dead Arab at my feet was proof of what could be done. So I examined again along the wall, and found here and there chippings as if someone had been tapping with a heavy hammer. This, then, had been what happened. The grave robber, more expert at his work than we had been, and suspecting the presence of a hidden serdab, had made essay to find it. He had struck the spring by chance, had released the avenging treasurer, as the Arabian writer designated him. The issue spoke for itself. I got a piece of wood, and, standing at a safe distance, pressed with the end of it upon the star. Instantly the stone flew back. The hidden figure within darted forward, and thrust out its lance. Then it rose up and disappeared.
I thought I might now
safely press on the 7 stars, and did so. Again the stone rolled back, and the treasurer flashed by to his hidden lair. I repeated both experiments several times, with always the same result.
I
Should have liked to examine the mechanism of that figure of such malignant mobility, but it was not possible without such tools as could not easily be had. It might be necessary to cut into a whole section of the rock. Some day I hope to go back, properly equipped, and attempt it. Perhaps you do not know that the entrance to a serdab is almost always very narrow. Sometimes a hand can hardly be inserted. 2 things I learned from this serdab. The first was that the lamps, if lamps at all there had been, could not have been of large size, and secondly that they would be in some way associated with Hathor, whose symbol, the hawk in a square with the right top corner forming a smaller square, was cut in relief on the wall within, and colored the bright vermilion which we had found on the steel. Hathor is the goddess who in Egyptian mythology answers to Venus of the Greeks, in as far as she is the presiding deity of beauty and pleasure.
in the
Egyptian mythology, however, each god has many forms, and in some aspects Hathor has to do with the idea of resurrection. There are 7 forms or variants of the goddess. Why should not these correspond in some way to the 7 lamps? That there had been such lamps, I was convinced. The first grave robber had met his death. The second had found the contents of the serdab. The first attempt had been made years since. The state of the body proved this. I had no clue to the second attempt.
it might
Have been long ago, or it might have been recently. If, however, others had been to the tomb, it was probable that the lamps had been taken long ago.
well
All the more difficult would be my search, for undertaken it must be. That was nearly 3 years ago, and for all that time I've been like the man in the Arabian Nights, seeking old lamps, not for new, but for cash.
I
Dared not say what I was looking for, or attempt to give any description, for such would have defeated my purpose. But I had in my own mind at the start a vague idea of what I must find. In process of time this grew more and more clear, till at last I almost overshot my mark by searching for something which might have been wrong. The disappointments I suffered and the wild goose chases I made would fill a volume, but I persevered. At last, not 2 months ago, I was shown by an old dealer in Mosul one lamp such as I had looked for. I had been tracing it for nearly a year, always suffering disappointment, but always buoyed up to further endeavor by a growing hope that I was on the track. I do not know how I restrained myself when I realized that, at last, I was at least close to success. I was skilled, however, in the finesse of Eastern trade, and the Juara-Portuguese trader met his match. I wanted to see all his stock before buying, and one by one he produced, amongst masses of rubbish, 7 different lamps. Each of them had a distinguishing mark, and each and all was some form of the symbol of Hathor. I think I shook the imperturbability of my swarthy friend by the magnitude of my purchases, for in order to prevent him guessing what form of goods I sought, I nearly cleared out his shop. At the end he nearly wept, and said I had ruined him, for now he had nothing to sell. He would have torn his hair, had he known what price I should ultimately have given for some of his stock, that perhaps he valued least. I parted with most of my merchandise at normal price as I hurried home.
I
Did not dare to give it away, or even lose it, lest I should incur suspicion.
my
Burden was far too precious to be risked by any foolishness now. I got on as fast as it is possible to travel in such countries, and arrived in London with only the lamps and certain portable curios and papyri which I had picked up on my travels. Now, Mr. Ross, you know all I know, and I leave it to your discretion how much, if any of it, you will tell Miss Trelawny. As he finished, a clear young voice said behind us, "What about Miss Trelawny?" "She is here." We turned, startled, and looked at each other inquiringly. Miss Trelawny stood in the doorway. We did not know how long she had been present, or how much she had heard. Chapter 13. Awaking from the trance. The first unexpected words may always startle a hearer, but when the shock is over, the listener's reason has asserted itself, and he can judge of the manner as well as of the matter of speech. Thus it was on this occasion. With intelligence now alert, I could not doubt of the simple sincerity of Margaret's next question. What have you two men been talking about all this time, Mr. Ross?
I
Suppose Mr. Corbeck has been telling you all his adventures in finding the lamps. I hope you will tell me too some day, Mr. Corbeck, but that must not be till my poor father is better. He would like, I am sure, to tell me all about these things himself, or to be present when I heard them. She glanced sharply from one to the other. Oh, that was what you were saying as I
came in? Margaret and I disagree on
one point. I am about to make an experiment, the experiment which is to crown all that I have devoted 20 years of research and danger and labor to prepare for. Through it we may learn things that have been hidden from the eyes and the knowledge of men for centuries, for scores of centuries. I do not want my daughter to be present, for I cannot blind myself to the fact that there may be danger in it, great danger, and of an unknown
kind.
I have, however, already faced very great dangers and of an unknown kind, and so has that brave scholar who has helped me in the work. As to myself, I am willing to run any risk, for science and history and philosophy may benefit, and we may turn one old page of a wisdom unknown in this prosaic age. But for my daughter to run such a risk, I am loath. Her young, bright life is too precious to throw lightly away, now especially when she is on the very threshold of new happiness. I do not wish to see her life given as her dear mother's was. He broke down for a moment and covered his eyes with his hands.
In an
instant Margaret was beside him, clasping him close and kissing him, and comforting him with loving words. Then, standing erect, with one hand on his head, she said, Father, Mother did not bid you stay beside her, even when you wanted to. Go on that journey of unknown danger to Egypt, though that country was then upset from end to end with war and the dangers that follow war. You have told me how she left you free to go as you wished, though that she thought of danger for you and feared it for you, is proved by this.
She
held up her wrist with a scar that seemed to run blood. Now, mother's daughter does as mother would have done herself. Then she turned to me. Malcolm, you know I love you, but love is trust, and you must trust me in danger as well as in joy. You and I must stand beside Father in this unknown peril. Together we shall come through it, or together we shall fail. Together.
Visheldi.
That is my wish, my first wish to my husband, that is to be.
Do
you not think that, as a daughter, I am right? Tell my father what you think. She looked like a queen stooping to plead. My love for her grew and grew.
I
stood up beside her, and took her hand and said, Mr. Trelawny, in this Margaret and I are one. He took both our hands and held them hard. Presently, he said with deep emotion, It is as her mother would have done. Mr. Corbeck and Dr. Winchester came exactly at the time appointed, and joined us in the library. Despite my great happiness, I felt our meeting to be a very solemn function, for I could never forget the strange things that had been, and the idea of the strange things which might be was with me, like a cloud, pressing down on us all. From the gravity of my companions I gathered that each of them also was ruled by some such dominating thought. Instinctively we gathered our chairs into a circle round Mr. Trelawny, who had taken the great armchair near the window. Margaret sat by him on his right, and I was next to her. Mr. Corbeck was on his left with Dr. Winchester on the other side. After a few seconds of silence, Mr. Trelawny said to Mr. Corbeck, You have told Dr. Winchester all up to the present as we arranged? Yes, he answered. So Mr. Trelawney said. And I have told Margaret, so we all know. Then, turning to the doctor, he
asked.
And am I to take it that you, knowing all as we know it who have followed the matter for years, wish to share in the experiment which we hope to make? His answer was direct and uncompromising. Certainly. Why, when this matter was fresh to me, I offered to go on with it. To the end. Now that it is of such strange interest, I would not miss it for anything which you could name. Be quite easy in your mind, Mr. Trelawney.
I
am a scientist and an investigator of phenomena. I have no one belonging to
me or dependent on me.
I am quite alone and free to do what I like with my own, including my life. Mr. Trelawney bowed gravely and, turning to Mr. Corbeck, said, I have known your ideas for many years past, old friend, so I need ask you nothing. As to Margaret and Malcolm Ross, they have already told me their wishes in no uncertain way. He paused a few seconds as though to put his thoughts or his words in order. Then he began to explain his views and intentions. He spoke very carefully, seeming always to bear in mind that some of us who listened were ignorant of the very root and nature of some things touched upon, and explaining them to us as he went on. The experiment which is before us is to try whether or no there is any force, any reality in the old magic. There could not possibly be more favorable conditions for the test, and it is my own desire to do all that is possible to make the original design effective. That there is some such existing power, I firmly believe. It might not be possible to create, or arrange, or organize such a power in our own time, but I take it that if in old times such a power existed, it may have some exceptional survival. After all, the Bible is not a myth, and we read there that the sun stood still at a man's command, and that an ass, not a human one, spoke. And if the witch at Ender could call up to Saul the spirit of Samuel, why may not there have been others with equal powers, and why may not one among them survive? Indeed, we are told in the book of Samuel that the witch of Ender was only one of many, and her being consulted by Saul was a matter of chance. He only sought one among the many whom he had driven out of Israel. All those that had familiar spirits, and the wizards. This Egyptian queen, Tera, who reigned nearly 2,000 years before Saul, had a familiar, and was a wizard too. See how the priests of her time, and those after it, tried to wipe out her name from the face of the earth, and put a curse over the very door of her tomb, so that none might ever discover the lost name. And they succeeded so well that even Manetho, the historian of the Egyptian kings, writing in the 10th century before Christ, with all the lore of the priesthood for 40 centuries behind him, and with possibility of access to every existing record, could not even find her name. Did it strike any of you, in thinking of the late events, who or what her familiar was? There was an interruption, for Dr. Winchester struck one hand loudly on the other as he ejaculated, "The cat! The mummy cat! I knew it!" Mr. Trelawney smiled over at him. "You are right. There is every indication that the familiar of the wizard queen was that cat which was mummied when she was, and was not only placed in her tomb, but was laid in the sarcophagus with her. That was what bit into my wrist, what cut me with sharp claws." He paused. Margaret's comment was a purely girlish one. "Then my poor Silvio is acquitted. I am glad." Her father stroked her hair and went on. "This woman seems to have had an extraordinary foresight. Foresight far, far beyond her age and the philosophy of her time. She seems to have seen through the weakness of her own religion, and even prepared for emergence into a different world. All her aspirations were for the north, the point of the compass, whence blew the cool, invigorating breezes that make life a joy. From the first, her eyes seemed to have been attracted to the 7 stars of the plough, from the fact, as recorded in the hieroglyphics in her tomb, that at her birth a great aerolite fell from whose heart was finally extracted that jewel of 7 stars which she regarded as the talisman of her life. It seems to have so far ruled her destiny that all her thought and care circled round it. The magic coffer, so wondrously wrought with 7 sides, we learn from the same source, came from the aerolite. 7 was to her a magic number, and no wonder. With 7 fingers on one hand and 7 toes on one foot, with a talisman of a rare ruby with 7 stars in the same position as in that constellation which ruled her birth, each star of the 7 having 7 points, in itself a geological wonder. It would have been odd if she had not been attracted by it. Again, she was born, we learn, in the stele of her tomb, in the 7th month of the year, the month beginning with the inundation of the Nile, of which month the presiding goddess was Hathor, the goddess of her own house, of the Antephs of the Theban line, the goddess who in various forms symbolizes beauty and pleasure and resurrection. Again, in this 7th month, which, by later Egyptian astronomy, began on October 28th and ran to the 27th of our November, on the 7th day the pointer of the plough just rises above the horizon of the sky at Thebes. In a marvelously strange way, therefore, are grouped into this woman's life these various things. The number 7, the pole star, with the constellation of 7 stars, the god of the month, Hathor, who was her own particular god, the god of her family, the Antephs of the Theban dynasty, whose king symbol it was, and whose 7 forms ruled love and the delights of life and resurrection. If ever there was ground for magic, for the power of symbolism carried into mystic use, for a belief in finite spirits, in an age which knew not the living God, it is here. Remember, too, that this woman was skilled in all the science of her time. Her wise and cautious father took care of that, knowing that by her own wisdom she must ultimately combat the intrigues of the hierarchy. Bear in mind that in old Egypt the science of astronomy began and was developed to an extraordinary height, and that astrology followed astronomy in its progress. And it is possible that in the later developments of science with regard to light rays, we may yet find that astrology is on a scientific basis. Our next wave of scientific thought may deal with this. I shall have something special to call your minds to on this point presently. Bear in mind also that the Egyptians knew sciences of which today, despite all our advantages, we are profoundly ignorant. Acoustics, for instance, an exact science with the builders of the temples of Karnak, of Luxor, of the pyramids, is today a mystery to Bell and Kelvin and Edison and Marconi. Again, these old miracle workers probably understood some practical way of using other forces, and amongst them the forces of light, that at present we do not dream of. But of this matter I shall speak later. That magic coffer of Queen Tera is probably a magic box in more ways than one. It may, possibly it does, contain forces that we wot not of. We cannot open it. It must be closed from within. How then was it closed? It is a coffer of solid stone, of amazing hardness, more like a jewel than an ordinary marble, with a lid equally solid, and yet all is so finely wrought that the finest tool made today cannot be inserted under the flange. How is it wrought to such perfection? How is the stone so chosen that those translucent patches match the relations of the 7 stars of the constellation? How is it, or from what cause, that when the starlight shines on it, it glows from within, that when I fix the lamps in similar form the glow grows greater still, and yet the box is irresponsive to ordinary light however great? I tell you that that box hides some great mystery of science. We shall find that the light will open it in some way, either by striking on some substance sensitive in a peculiar way to its effect, or in releasing some greater power. I only trust that in our ignorance we may not so bungle things as to do harm to its mechanism, and so deprive the knowledge of our time of a lesson handed down, as by a miracle through nearly 5,000 years. In another way, too, there may be hidden in that box secrets which, for good or ill, may enlighten the world. We know from their records and, inferentially also, that the Egyptians studied the properties of herbs and minerals for magic purposes, white magic as well as black.
We know that
Some of the wizards of old could induce from sleep dreams of any given
kind.
that this purpose was mainly affected by hypnotism, which was another art or science of old Nile, I have little doubt. But still, they must have had a mastery of drugs that is far beyond anything we know.
With our
Own pharmacopoeia we can, to a certain extent, induce dreams. We may even differentiate between good and bad, dreams of pleasure, or disturbing and harrowing dreams. But these old practitioners seem to have been able to command at will any form or color of dreaming, could work round any given subject or thought in almost any was required.
in that
Coffer, which you have seen, may rest a very armory of dreams.
indeed.
Some of the forces that lie within it may have been already used in my household. Again, there was an interruption from Dr. Winchester. But if in your case some of these imprisoned forces were used, what set them free at the opportune time, or how? Besides, you and Mr. Corbeck were once before put into a trance for 3 whole days, when you were in the Queen's tomb for the second time. And then, as I gathered from Mr. Corbeck's story, the coffer was not back in the tomb, though the mummy
Was
surely in both these cases there must have been some active intelligence awake, and with some other power to wield. Mr. Trelawny's answer was equally to the point. There was some active intelligence awake. I am convinced of it. And it wielded a power which it never lacks. I believe that on both those occasions, hypnotism was the power wielded. And wherein is that power contained? What view do you hold on the subject? Dr. Winchester's voice vibrated with the intensity of his excitement as he leaned forward, breathing hard, and with eyes staring. Mr. Trelawny said solemnly, "In the mummy of the Queen Tera. I was coming to that presently. Perhaps we had better wait till I clear the ground a little. What I hold is that the preparation of that box was made for a special occasion, as indeed were all the preparations of a tomb and all belonging to it. Queen Tera did not trouble herself to guard against snakes and scorpions in that rocky tomb, cut in the sheer cliff face 100 feet above the level of the valley and 50 down from the summit. Her precautions were against the disturbances of human hands, against the jealousy and hatred of the priests, who, had they known of her real aims, would have tried to baffle them. From her point of view, she made all ready for the time of resurrection, whenever that might be. I gather from the symbolic pictures in the tomb that she so far differed from the belief of her time that she looked for a resurrection in the
flesh.
It was doubtless this that intensified the hatred of the priesthood, and gave them an acceptable cause for obliterating the very existence, present and future, of one who had outraged their theories and blasphemed their
Gods.
all that she might require, either in the accomplishment of the resurrection or after it, were contained in that almost hermetically sealed suite of chambers in the rock. In the great sarcophagus, which, as you know, is of a size quite unusual even for kings, was the mummy of her familiar, the cat, which from its great size I take to be a sort of tiger cat. In the tomb also, in a strong receptacle, were the canopic jars, usually containing those internal organs which are separately embalmed, but which in this case had no such contents. So that, I take it, there was in her case a departure in embalming, and that the organs were restored to the body, each in its proper place, if, indeed, they had ever been removed. If this surmise be true, we shall find that the brain of the queen either was never extracted in the usual way, or, if so taken out, that it was duly replaced instead of being enclosed within the mummy wrappings. Finally, in the sarcophagus there was the magic coffer on which her feet rested. Mark you also the care taken in the preservance of her power to control the elements. According to her belief, the open hand outside the wrappings controlled the air, and the strange jewel stone with the shining stars controlled fire.
The symbolism
Inscribed on the soles of her feet gave sway over land and water.
about the
Starstone I shall tell you later, but whilst we are speaking of the sarcophagus, mark how she guarded her secret in case of grave-wrecking or intrusion. None could open her magic coffer without the lamps, for we know now that ordinary light will not be effective. The great lid of the sarcophagus was not sealed down as usual because she wished to control
the air.
but she hid the lamps, which in structure belonged to the magic coffer, in a place where none could find them, except by following the secret guidance which she had prepared for only the eyes of wisdom. And even here she had guarded against chance discovery by preparing a bolt of death for the unwary discoverer. To do this, she had applied the lesson of the tradition of the avenging guard of the treasures of the pyramid, built by her great predecessor of the fourth dynasty of the throne of Egypt. You have noted, I suppose, how there were, in the case of her tomb, certain deviations from the usual rules. For instance, the shaft of the mummy pit, which is usually filled up solid with stones and rubbish, was left open. Why was this? I take it that she had made arrangements for leaving the tomb when, after her resurrection, she should be a new woman with a different personality and less inured to the hardships that in her first existence she had suffered. So far as we can judge of her intent, all things needful for her exit into the world had been thought of, even to the iron chain described by Van Hine close to the door in the rock, by which she might be able to lower herself to the ground. That she expected a long period to elapse was shown in the choice of material. An ordinary rope would be rendered weaker or unsafe in process of time, but she imagined, and rightly, that the iron would endure. What her intentions were when once she trod the open earth afresh we do not know, and we never shall, unless her own dead lips can soften and speak. Chapter 15. The Purpose of Queen Tera. Now, as to the star jewel, this she manifestly regarded as the greatest of her treasures. On it she had engraven words which none of her time dared
to speak.
In the old Egyptian belief, it was held that there were words which, if used properly, for the method of speaking them was as important as the words themselves, could command the lords of the upper and the lower worlds. The heikau, or word of power, was all-important in certain ritual.
On the
jewel of 7 stars, which, as you know, is carved into the image of a scarab, are graven in hieroglyphic 2 such heikau, one above the other. Underneath. But you will understand better when you see it. Wait here.
Do
not stir. As he spoke, he rose and left the room. A great fear for him came over me, but I was in some strange way relieved when I looked at Margaret. Whenever there had been any possibility of danger to her father, she had shown great fear for him. Now she was calm and placid. I said nothing, but waited. In 2 or 3 minutes, Mr. Trelawny returned. He held in his hand a little golden box. This, as he resumed his seat, he placed before him on the table. We all leaned forward as he opened it. On a lining of white satin lay a wondrous ruby of immense size, almost as big as the top joint of Margaret's little finger. It was carven. It could not possibly have been its natural shape, but jewels do not show the working of the tool, into the shape of a scarab, with its wings folded and its legs and feelers pressed back to its sides. Shining through its wondrous pigeons, blood color were 7 different stars, each of 7 points, in such position that they reproduced exactly the figure of the plow. There could be no possible mistake as to this in the mind of anyone who had ever noted the constellation. On it were some hieroglyphic figures cut with the most exquisite precision, as I could see when it came to my turn to use the magnifying glass, which Mr. Trelawney took from his pocket and handed to us. When we all had seen it fully, Mr. Trelawney turned it over so that it rested on its back in a cavity made to hold it in the upper half of the box. The reverse was no less wonderful than the upper, being carved to resemble the under side of the beetle. It, too, had some hieroglyphic figures cut on it. Mr. Trelawney resumed his lecture as we all sat with our heads close to this wonderful jewel. As you see, there are two words, one on the top, the other underneath. The symbols on the top represent a single word composed of one syllable, prolonged, with its determinatives. You know, all of you, I suppose, that the Egyptian language was phonetic and that the hieroglyphic symbol represented the sound. The first symbol here, the ho, means mare, and the two pointed ellipses, the prolongation of the final r, merar. The sitting figure, with the hand to its face, is what we call the determinative of thought, and the role of papyrus, that of abstraction. Thus we get the word mare, love, in its abstract, general, and fullest sense. This is the hey-cow which can command the upper world. Margaret's face was a glory as she said in a deep, low, ringing tone, "Oh, but it is true. How the old wonder-workers guessed at almighty truth." Then a hot blush swept her face, and her eyes fell. Her father smiled at her lovingly as he resumed, "The symbolization of the word on the reverse is simpler, though the meaning is more abstruse. The first symbol means men, abiding, and the second, of the heart. So that we get abiding of heart, or in our own language, patience. And this is the hey-cow to control the lower world." He closed the box and, motioning us to remain as we were, he went back to his room to replace the jewel in the safe. When he had returned and resumed his seat, he went on. That jewel, with its mystic words, and which Queen Tera held under her hand in the sarcophagus, was to be an important factor, probably the most important, in the working out of the act of her resurrection. From the first I seemed by a sort of instinct to realize this. I kept the jewel within my great safe, whence none could extract it, not even Queen Tera herself with her astral body. Her astral body? What is that, father? What does that mean? There was a keenness in Margaret's voice as she asked the question which surprised me a little, but Trelawney smiled a sort of indulgent parental smile, which came through his grim solemnity, like sunshine through a rift cloud, as he spoke. The astral body, which is a part of Buddhist belief, long subsequent to the time I speak of, and which is an accepted fact of modern mysticism, had its rise in ancient Egypt, at least so far as we know. It is that the gifted individual can, at will, quick as thought itself, transfer his body whithersoever he chooses by the dissolution and reincarnation of particles. In the ancient belief there were several parts of a human being. You may as well know them so that you will understand matters relative to them or dependent on them as they occur. First there is the ka, or double, which, as Dr. Budge explains, may be defined as an abstract individuality of personality which was imbued with all the characteristic attributes of the individual it represented and possessed an absolutely independent existence. It was free to move from place to place on earth at will, and it could enter into heaven and hold converse with the gods. Then there was the ba, or soul, which dwelt in the ka and had the power of becoming corporeal or incorporeal at will. It had both substance and form. It had power to leave the tomb. It could revisit the body in the tomb and could reincarnate it and hold converse with it. Again there was the ku, the spiritual intelligence or spirit. It took the form of a shining, luminous, intangible shape of the body. Then, again there was the sikum, or power of a man, his strength or vital force personified. These were the kaibit, or shadow, the run, or name, the kot, or physical body, and of the heart, in which life was seated, went to the full making up of a man. Thus you will see that if this division of functions, spiritual and bodily, ethereal and corporeal, ideal and actual, be accepted as exact, there are all the possibilities and capabilities of corporeal transference, guided always by an unimprisonable will or intelligence. As he paused, I murmured the lines from Shelley's Prometheus Unbound. The Magnus Zoroaster met his own image walking in the garden. Mr. Trelawny was not displeased. "Quite so," he said, in his quiet way. Shelley had a better conception of ancient beliefs than any of our poets. With a voice changed again, he resumed his lecture, for so it was to some of us. "There is another belief of the ancient Egyptian which you must bear in mind, that regarding the Ashaptiu figures of Osiris, which were placed with the dead to its work in the underworld. The enlargement of this idea came to a belief that it was possible to transmit, by magical formulae, the soul and qualities of any living creature to a figure made in its image. This would give a terrible extension of power to one who held the gift of magic. It is from a union of these various beliefs and their natural corollaries that I have come to the conclusion that Queen Tera expected to be able to effect her own resurrection when and where and how she would, that she may have held before her a definite time for making her effort is not only possible but likely. I shall not stop now to explain it, but shall enter upon the subject later on. With a soul with the gods, a spirit which could wander the earth at will, and a power of corporeal transference, or an astral body, there need be no bounds or limits to her ambition. The belief is forced upon us that for these 40 or 50 centuries she lay dormant in her tomb, waiting with that patience which could rule the gods of the underworld, for that love which could command those of the upper world. What she may have dreamt we know not, but her dream must have been broken when the Dutch explorer entered her sculptured cavern and his follower violated the sacred privacy of her tomb by his rude outrage in the theft of her hand. That theft, with all that followed, proved to us one thing, however, that each part of her body, though separated from the rest, can be a central point or rallying place for the items or particles of her astral body. That hand in my room could ensure her instantaneous presence in the flesh, and its
E quali rapid dissolution.
Now comes the crown of my argument. The purpose of the attack on me was to get the safe open so that the sacred jewel of 7 stars could be extracted. That immense door of the safe could not keep out her astral body, which, or any part of it, could gather itself as well within as without the safe. And I doubt not that in the darkness of the night that mummied hand sought often the talisman jewel and drew new inspiration from its touch. But despite all its power, the astral body could not remove the jewel through the chinks of the safe. The ruby is not astral, and it could only be moved in the ordinary way by the opening of the doors. To this end the queen used her astral body and the fierce force of her familiar to bring to the keyhole of the safe the master key, which debarred her wish. For years I have suspected, nay, have believed as much, and I, too, guarded myself against powers of the nether world. I, too, waited in patience till I should have gathered together all the factors required for the opening of the magic coffer and the resurrection of the mummied queen. He paused, and his daughter's voice came out sweet and clear and full of intense feeling. Father, in the Egyptian belief, was the power of resurrection of a mummied body a general one, or was it limited? That is, could it achieve resurrection many times in the course of ages, or only once, and that one final? There was but one resurrection, he answered. There were some who believed that this was to be a definite resurrection of the body into the real world. But in the common belief, the spirit found joy in the Elysian fields, where there was plenty of food and no fear of famine, where there was moisture and deep-rooted reeds, and all the joys that are to be expected by the people of an arid land and burning clime. Then Margaret spoke with an earnestness which showed the conviction of her inmost soul. To me, then, it is given to understand what was the dream of this great and far-thinking and high-souled lady of old, the dream that held her soul in patient waiting for its realization through the passing of all those tens of centuries. The dream of a love that might be, a love that she felt she might, even under new conditions, herself evoke. The love that is the dream of every woman's life, of the old and of the new, pagan or Christian, under whatever sun, in whatever rank or calling, however may have been the joy or pain of her life in other ways.
Oh,
I know it. I know it. I am a woman, and I know a woman's heart. What were the lack of food or the plenitude of it? What were feast or famine to this woman, born in a palace, with the shadow of the crown of the two Egypts on her brows? Fearless it was. Intense, it was full of a divine calm. Mr. Trelawny took a long breath, and in a more cheerful, as well as in a more decided tone, went on. As we are all of one mind, the sooner we get the necessary matters in train, the better. Let me tell you that this place, like all the rest of the house, can be lit with electricity. We could not join the wires to the mains lest our secret should become known, but I have a cable here which we can attach in the hall and complete the circuit. As he was speaking, he began to ascend the
steps.
From close to the entrance, he took the end of a cable. This he drew forward and attached to a switch in the wall. Then, turning on a tap, he flooded the whole vault and staircase below with light. I could now see from the volume of light streaming up into the hallway that the hole beside the staircase went direct into the cave. Above it was a pulley and a mass of strong tackle with multiplying blocks of the Smeaton order. Mr. Trelawny, seeing me looking at this, said, correctly interpreting my thoughts, "Yes, it is new. I hung it there myself on purpose. I knew we should have to lower great weights, and, as I did not wish to take too many into my confidence, I arranged a tackle which I could work alone, if necessary. We set to work at once, and before nightfall had lowered, unhooked, and placed in the positions designated for each by Trelawny, all the great sarcophagi and all the curios and other matters which we had taken with us. It was a strange and weird proceeding, the placing of those wonderful monuments of a bygone age in that green cavern, which represented in its cutting and purpose and up-to-date mechanism and electric lights both the old world and the new. But as time went on, I grew more and more to recognize the wisdom and correctness of Mr. Trelawny's choice.
I was much
disturbed when Silvio, who had been brought into the cave in the arms of his mistress, and who was lying asleep on my coat which I had taken off, sprang up when the cat mummy had been unpacked, and flew at it with the same ferocity which he had previously exhibited. The incident showed Margaret in a new phase, and one which gave my heart a pang. She had been standing quite still at one side of the cave, leaning on a sarcophagus, in one of those fits of abstraction which had of late come upon her. But on hearing the sound, and seeing Silvio's violent onslaught, she seemed to fall into a positive fury of passion. Her eyes blazed, and her mouth took a hard, cruel tension which was new to me. Instinctively, she stepped toward Silvio, as if to interfere in the attack. But I too had stepped forward, and as she caught my eye, a strange spasm came upon her, and she stopped. Its intensity made me hold my breath, and I put up my hand to clear my eyes. When I had done this, she had on the instant recovered her calm, and there was a look of brief wonder on her face. With all her old grace and sweetness, she swept over and lifted Silvio, just as she had done on former occasions, and held him in her arms, petting him and treating him as though he were a little child who had erred. As I looked, a strange fear came over me. The Margaret that I knew seemed to be changing, and in my inmost heart I prayed that the disturbing cause might soon come to an end. More than ever I longed at that moment that our terrible experiment should come to a prosperous termination. When all had been arranged in the room, as Mr. Trelawney wished, he turned to us one after another, till he had concentrated the intelligence of us all upon him. Then he said, "All is now ready in this place. We must only await the proper time to begin." We were silent for a while. Dr. Winchester was the first to speak. "What is the proper time? Have you any approximation, even if you are not satisfied as to the exact day?" He answered at once. "After the most anxious thought, I have fixed on July 31st. May I ask why that date?" He spoke his answer slowly. Queen Tera was ruled in great degree by mysticism, and there are so many evidences that she looked for resurrection that naturally she would choose a period ruled over by a god specialized to such a purpose. Now, the fourth month of the season of inundation was ruled by Harmachis, this being the name for Ra, the sun god, at his rising in the morning, and therefore typifying the awakening or arising. This arising is manifestly to physical life, since it is of the midworld of human daily life. Now, as this month begins on our July 25th, the seventh day would be July 31st, for you may be sure that the mystic queen would not have chosen any day but the seventh or some power of seven. I dare say that some of you have wondered why our preparations have been so deliberately undertaken. This is why. We must be ready in every possible way when the time comes, but there was no use in having to wait round for a needless number of days. And so we waited only for the 31st of July, the next day but one, when the great experiment would be made. Chapter 17. Doubts and Fears. We learn of great things by little experiences. The history of ages is but an indefinite repetition of the history of hours. The record of a soul is but a multiple of the story of a moment. The recording angel writes in the great book in no rainbow tints. His pen is dipped in no colors but light and darkness. For the eye of infinite wisdom there is no need of shading. All things, all thoughts, all emotions, all experiences, all doubts and hopes and fears, all intentions, all wishes seen down to the lower strata of their concrete and multitudinous elements are finally resolved into direct opposites. Did any human being wish for the epitome of a life wherein were gathered and grouped all the experiences that a child of Adam could have, the history, fully and frankly written, of my own mind during the next 48 hours would afford him all that could be wanted, and the recorder could have wrought as usual in sunlight and shadow, which may be taken to represent the final expressions of heaven and hell. For in the highest heaven is faith, and doubt hangs over the yawning blackness of hell. There were, of course, times of sunshine in those 2 days, moments when, in the realization of Margaret's sweetness and her love for me, all doubts were dissipated like morning mist before the sun. But the balance of the time, and an overwhelming balance, it was gloom hung over me like a pall. The hour, in whose coming I had acquiesced, was approaching so quickly and was already so near that the sense of finality was bearing upon me. The issue was perhaps life or death to any of us, but for this we were all prepared. Margaret and I were one as to the risk. The question of the moral aspect of the case, which involved the religious belief in which I had been reared, was not one to trouble me, for the issues and the causes that lay behind them were not within my power even to comprehend. The doubt of the success of the great experiment was such a doubt as exists in all enterprises which have great possibilities. To me, whose life was passed in a series of intellectual struggles, this form of doubt was a stimulus, rather than deterrent. What then was it that made for me a trouble, which became an anguish when my thoughts dwelt long on it? I was beginning to doubt Margaret. What it was that I doubted I knew not. It was not her love, or her honor, or her truth, or her kindness, or her zeal. What then was it? It was herself. Margaret was changing. At times during the past few days, I had hardly known her as the same girl whom I had met at the picnic and whose vigils I had shared in the sick room of her father. Then, even in her moments of greatest sorrow or fright or anxiety, she was all life and thought and keenness. Now she was generally distrait and, at times, in a sort of negative condition, as though her mind, her very being, was not present. At such moments, she would have full possession of observation and memory. She would know and remember all that was going on and had gone on around her. But her coming back to her old self had to me something the sensation of a new person coming into the room. Up to the time of leaving London, I had been content whenever she was present. I had over me that delicious sense of security which comes with the consciousness that love is mutual. But now doubt had taken its place. I never knew whether the personality present was my Margaret, the old Margaret whom I had loved at the first glance, or the other new Margaret whom I hardly understood, and whose intellectual aloofness made an impalpable barrier between us. Sometimes she would become, as it were, awake all at once. At such times, though she would say to me sweet and pleasant things which she had often said before, she would seem most unlike herself. It was almost as if she was speaking parrot-like, or at dictation of one who could read words or acts, but not thoughts. After one or two experiences of this kind, my own doubting began to make a barrier, for I could not speak with the ease and freedom which were usual to me, and so hour by hour we drifted apart. Were it not for the few odd moments when the old Margaret was back with me full of her charm, I do not know what would have happened, as it was each such moment gave me a fresh start and kept my love from changing. I would have given the world for a confidant, but this was impossible. How could I speak a doubt of Margaret to anyone, even her father? How could I speak a doubt to Margaret, when Margaret herself was the theme? I could only endure and hope, and of the two the endurance was the lesser pain. I think that Margaret must have at times felt that there was some cloud between us, for towards the end of the first day she began to shun me a little, or perhaps it was that she had become more diffident than usual about me. Hitherto she had sought every opportunity of being with me, just as I had tried to be with her, so that now any avoidance, one of the other, made a new pain to us both. On this day the household seemed very still. Each one of us was about his own work or occupied with his own thoughts. We only met at meal times, and then, though we talked, all seemed more or less preoccupied. There was not in the house even the stir of the routine of service. The precaution of Mr. Trelawny in having 3 rooms prepared for each of us had rendered servants unnecessary. The dining room was solidly prepared with cooked provisions for several days. Towards evening, I went out by myself for a stroll. I had looked for Margaret to ask her to come with me, but when I found her, she was in one of her apathetic moods, and the charm of her presence seemed lost to me. Angry with myself, but unable to quell my own spirit of discontent, I went out alone over the rocky headland. On the cliff, with the wide expanse of wonderful sea before me, and no sound but the dash of waves below and the harsh screams of the seagulls above, my thoughts ran free. Do what I would, they returned continuously to one subject, the solving of the doubt that was upon me. Here in the solitude, amid the wide circle of nature's force and strife, my mind began to work truly. Unconsciously, I found myself asking a question which I would not allow myself to answer. At last the persistence of a mind working truly prevailed. I found myself face to face with my doubt. The habit of my life began to assert itself, and I analyzed the evidence before me. It was so startling that I had to force myself into obedience to logical effort. My starting place was this: Margaret was changed in what way and by what means? Was it her character, or her mind, or her nature. For her, physical appearance remained the same. I began to group all that I had ever heard of her, beginning at her birth. It was strange at the very first. She had been, according to Corbeck's statement, born of a dead mother during the time that her father and his friend were in a trance in the tomb at Aswan. That trance was presumably affected by a woman mummied, yet preserving, as we had every reason to believe from after experience, an astral body subject to a free will and an active intelligence. With that astral body, space ceased to exist. The vast distance between London and Aswan became as naught, and whatever power of necromancy the sorceress had might have been exercised over the dead mother and possibly the dead child. The dead child. Was it possible that the child was dead and was made alive again? Whence then came the animating spirit, the soul? Logic was pointing the way to me now with a vengeance. If the Egyptian belief was true for Egyptians, then the Ka of the dead queen and her coup could animate what she might choose. In such case, Margaret would not be an individual at all, but simply a phase of Queen Tera herself, an astral body obedient to her will. Here I revolted against logic. Every fiber of my being resented such a conclusion. How could I believe that there was no Margaret at all, but just an animated image, used by the double of a woman of 40 centuries ago to its own ends? Somehow, the outlook was brighter to me now, despite the new doubts. At least I had Margaret. Back swung the logical pendulum again. The child then was not dead. If so, had the sorceress had anything to do with her birth at all? It was evident, so I took it again from Corbeck, that there was a strange likeness between Margaret and the pictures of Queen Tera. How could this be?
It could not be
any birthmark reproducing what had been in the mother's mind, for Mrs. Trelawny had never seen the pictures. Nay, even her father had not seen them till he had found his way into the tomb only a few days before her birth. This phase I could not get rid of so easily as the last. The fibers of my being remained quiet. There remained to me the horror of doubt. And even then, so strange is the mind of man, doubt itself took a concrete image. A vast and impenetrable gloom, through which flickered irregularly and spasmodically tiny points of evanescent light, which seemed to quicken the darkness into a positive existence. The remaining possibility of relations between Margaret and the mummied queen was that in some occult way the sorceress had power to change places with the other. This view of things could not be so lightly thrown aside. There were too many suspicious circumstances to warrant this, now that my attention was fixed on it and my intelligence recognized the possibility. Hereupon there began to come into my mind all the strange, incomprehensible matters which had whirled through our lives in the last few days. At first they all crowded in upon me in a jumbled mass, but again, the habit of mind of my working life prevailed, and they took order. I found it now easier to control myself, for there was something to grasp, some work to be done, though it was of a sorry kind, for it was, or might be, antagonistic to Margaret. But Margaret was herself at stake. I was thinking of her and fighting for her, and yet if I were to work in the dark, I might be even harmful to her. My first weapon in her defense was truth. I must know and understand. I might then be able to act. Certainly, I could not act beneficently without a just conception and recognition of the facts. Arranged in order, these were as follows. Firstly, the strange likeness of Queen Tera to Margaret, who had been born in another country 1,000 miles away, where her mother could not possibly have had even a passing knowledge of her appearance. Secondly, the disappearance of Van Hyne's book when I had read up to the description of the star ruby. Thirdly, the finding of the lamps in the boudoir. Tera, with her astral body, could have unlocked the door of Corbeck's room in the hotel and have locked it again after her exit with the lamps. She could, in the same way, have opened the window and put the lamps in the boudoir. It need not have been that Margaret in her own person should have had any hand in this. But it was at least strange. Fourthly, here the suspicions of the detective and the doctor came back to me with renewed force and with a larger understanding. Fifthly, there were the occasions on which Margaret foretold with accuracy the coming occasions of quietude, as though she had some conviction or knowledge of the intentions of the astral-bodied queen. Sixthly, there was her suggestion of the finding of the ruby which her father had lost. As I thought now afresh over this episode in the light of suspicion, in which her own powers were involved, the only conclusion I could come to was, always supposing that the theory of the queen's astral power was correct, that Queen Tera being anxious that all should go well in the movement from London to Keelan had in her own way taken the jewel from Mr. Trelawny's pocketbook, finding it of some use in her supernatural guardianship of the journey. Then in some mysterious way she had, through Margaret, made the suggestion of its loss and finding. Seventhly and lastly was the strange dual existence which Margaret seemed of late to be leading, and which in some way seemed a consequence or corollary of all that had gone before. The dual existence. This was indeed the conclusion which overcame all difficulties and reconciled opposites. If indeed Margaret were not in all ways a free agent, but could be compelled to speak or act as she might be instructed, or if her whole being could be changed for another without the possibility of any one noticing the doing of it, then all things were possible. All would depend on the spirit of the individuality by which she could be so compelled. If this individuality were just and kind and clean, all might be well. But if not, the thought was too awful for words. I ground my teeth with futile rage as the ideas of horrible possibilities swept through me. Up to this morning, Margaret's lapses into her new self had been few and hardly noticeable, save when once or twice her attitude towards myself had been marked by a bearing strange to me. But today the contrary was the case, and the change presaged badly. It might be that other individuality was of the lower, not of the better sort. Now that I thought of it, I had reason to fear. In the history of the mummy, from the time of Van Hines breaking into the tomb, the record of deaths that we knew of, presumably affected by her will and agency, was a startling one. The Arab who had stolen the hand from the mummy, and the one who had taken it from his body. The Arab chief who had tried to steal the jewel from Van Hine, and whose throat bore the marks of 7 fingers. The 2 men found dead on the first night of Trelawny's taking away the sarcophagus, and the 3 on the return to the tomb. The Arab who had opened the secret serdab. 9 dead men, one of them slain manifestly by the queen's own hand. And beyond this again the several savage attacks on Mr. Trelawny in his own room, in which, aided by her familiar, she had tried to open the safe and to extract the talisman jewel. His device of fastening the key to his wrist by a steel bangle, though successful in the end, had well nigh cost him his life. If then the queen, intent on her resurrection under her own conditions, had, so to speak, waded to it through blood, what might she not do were her purpose thwarted? What terrible step might she not take to effect her wishes? Nay, what were her wishes? What was her ultimate purpose? As yet, we had had only Margaret's statement of them, given in all the glorious enthusiasm of her lofty soul. In her record there was no expression of love to be sought or found. All we knew for certain was that she had set before her the object of resurrection, and that in it the north which she had manifestly loved was to have a special part, but that the resurrection was to be accomplished in the lonely tomb in the valley of the sorcerer was apparent. All preparations had been carefully made for accomplishment from within, and for her ultimate exit in her new and living form. The sarcophagus was unlidded. The oil jars, though hermetically sealed, were to be easily opened by hand, and in them provision was made for shrinkage. Through a vast period of time, even flint and steel were provided for the production of flame. The mummy pit was left open in violation of usage, and beside the stone door on the cliffside was fixed an imperishable chain by which she might in safety descend to earth. But as to what her after intentions were, we had no clue. If it was that she meant to begin life again as a humble individual, there was something so noble in the thought that it even warmed my heart to her and turned my wishes to her success. The very idea seemed to endorse Margaret's magnificent tribute to her purpose and help to calm my troubled spirit. Then and there, with this feeling strong upon me, I determined to warn Margaret and her father of dire possibilities, and to await, as well content as I could in my ignorance, the development of things over which I had no power. I returned to the house in a different frame of mind to that in which I had left it, and was enchanted to find Margaret, the old Margaret, waiting for
Me.
After dinner, when I was alone for a time with the father and daughter, I opened the subject, though with considerable hesitation. Would it not be well to take every possible precaution in case the Queen may not wish what we are doing, with regard to what may occur before the experiment, and at or after her waking, if it comes off? Margaret's answer came back quickly, so quickly that I was convinced she must have had it ready for someone. But she does approve. Surely it cannot be otherwise. Father is doing, with all his brains and all his energy and all his great courage, just exactly what the great Queen had arranged. But, I answered, that can hardly be. All that she arranged was in a tomb, high up in a rock, in a desert solitude, shut away from the world by every conceivable means. She seems to have depended on this isolation to ensure against accident. Surely, here in another country and age, with quite different conditions, she may in her anxiety make mistakes and treat any of us as she did those others in times gone past. 9 men that we know of have been slain by her own hand or by her instigation. She can be remorseless if she will. It did not strike me till afterwards, when I was thinking over this conversation, how thoroughly I had accepted the living and conscious condition of Queen Tera as a fact. Before I spoke, I had feared I might offend Mr. Trelawny, but to my pleasant surprise he smiled quite genially as he answered me. My dear fellow, in a way you are quite right. The Queen did undoubtedly intend isolation, and all told, it would be best that her experiment should be made as she arranged it. But just think, that became impossible when once the Dutch explorer had broken into her tomb. That was not my doing. I am innocent of it, though it was the cause of my setting out to rediscover the sepulchre. Mind, I do not say for a moment that I would not have done just the same as Van Hine. I went into the tomb from curiosity, and I took away what I did, being fired with the zeal of acquisitiveness which animates the collector. But remember also that at this time I did not know of the Queen's intention of resurrection. I had no idea of the completeness of her preparations. All that came long afterwards. But when it did come, I have done all that I could to carry out her wishes to the full.
My only fear is that I
may have misinterpreted some of her cryptic instructions, or have omitted or overlooked something. But of this I am certain. I have left undone nothing that I can imagine right to be done, and I have done nothing that I know of to clash with Queen Tera's arrangement. I want her great experiment to succeed. To this end I have not spared labor or time or money or myself. I have endured hardship and braved danger. All my brains, all my knowledge and learning, such as they are, all my endeavors, such as they can be, have been, are, and shall be devoted to this end, till we either win or lose the great stake that we play for. The great stake. I repeated, the resurrection of the woman and the woman's life? The proof that resurrection can be accomplished by magical powers, by scientific knowledge, or by use of some force which at present the world does not know. Then Mr. Trelawney spoke out the hopes of his heart which up to now he had indicated rather than expressed. Once or twice I had heard Corbeck speak of the fiery energy of his youth, but, save for the noble words of Margaret, when she had spoken of Queen Tera's hope, which coming from his daughter made possible a belief that her power was in some sense due to heredity, I had seen no marked sign of it. But now his words, sweeping before them like a torrent all antagonistic thought, gave me a new idea of the man. A woman's life. What is a woman's life in the scale with what we hope for? Why, we are risking already a woman's life, the dearest life to me in all the world, and that grows more dear with every hour that passes. We are risking as well the lives of 4 men, yours and my own, as well as those 2 others, who have been won to our confidence. The proof that resurrection can be accomplished, that is much a marvelous thing in this age of science, and the skepticism that knowledge makes. But life and resurrection are themselves but items in what may be won by the accomplishment of this great experiment. Imagine what it will be for the world of thought, the true world of human progress, the veritable road to the stars, the Tera ad astra of the ancients, if there can come back to us out of the unknown past one who can yield to us the lore stored in the great library of Alexandria and lost in its consuming flames. Not only history can be set right and the teachings of science made veritable from their beginnings, but we can be placed on the road to the knowledge of lost arts, lost learning, lost sciences, so that our feet may tread on the indicated path to their ultimate and complete restoration. Why, this woman can tell us what the world was like before what is called the flood, can give us the origin of that vast, astounding myth, can set the mind back to the consideration of things which to us now seem primeval, but which were old stories before the days of the patriarchs. But this is not the end. No, not even the beginning. If the story of this woman be all that we think, which some of us most firmly believe, if her powers and the restoration of them prove to be what we expect, why, then we may yet achieve a knowledge beyond what our age has ever known, beyond what is believed today possible for the children of men. If, indeed, this resurrection can be accomplished, how can we doubt the old knowledge, the old magic, the old belief? And if this be so, we must take it, that the Ka of this great and learned queen has won secrets of more than mortal worth from her surroundings amongst the stars. This woman in her life voluntarily went down living to the grave and came back again, as we learn from the records in her tomb. She chose to die her mortal death whilst young, so that at her resurrection in another age, beyond a trance of countless magnitude, she might emerge from her tomb in all the fullness and splendor of her youth and power. Already we have evidence that though her body slept in patience through those many centuries, her intelligence never passed away, that her resolution never flagged, that her will remained supreme, and, most important of all, that her memory was unimpaired. Oh, what possibilities are there in the coming of such a being into our midst? One whose history began before the concrete teaching of our Bible, whose experiences were antecedent to the formulation of the gods of Greece, who can link together the old and the new, earth and heaven, and yield to the known worlds of thought and physical existence the mystery of the unknown, of the old world in its youth, and of worlds beyond our ken. He paused, almost overcome. Margaret had taken his hand when he spoke of her being so dear to him, and held it hard. As he spoke, she continued to hold it, but there came over her face that change which I had so often seen of late, that mysterious veiling of her own personality which gave me the subtle sense of separation from her. In his impassioned vehemence her father did not notice, but when he stopped she seemed all at once to be herself again. In her glorious eyes came the added brightness of unshed tears, and with a gesture of passionate love and admiration, she stooped and kissed her father's hand. Then, turning to me, she too spoke. "Malcolm, you've spoken of the deaths that came from the poor queen, or rather that justly came from meddling with her arrangements and thwarting her purpose. Do you not think that, in putting it as you have done, you have been unjust? Who would not have done just as she did? Remember, she was fighting for her life. Aye, and for more than her life. For life and love, and all the glorious possibilities of that dim future in the unknown world of the North which had such enchanting hopes for her.
Do you not think that
She, with all the learning of her time, and with all the great and resistless force of her mighty nature, had hopes of spreading in a wider way the lofty aspirations of her soul, that she hoped to bring to the conquering of unknown worlds, and using to the advantage of her people all that she had won from sleep and death and time, all of which might and could have been frustrated by the ruthless hand of an assassin or a thief? Were it you, in such case would you not struggle by all means to achieve the object of your life, and hope, whose possibilities grew and grew in the passing of those endless
years?
Can you think that that active brain was at rest during all those weary centuries, whilst her free soul was flitting from world to world amongst the boundless regions of the stars? Had these stars in their myriad and varied life no lessons for her, as they have had for us since we followed the glorious path which she and her people marked for us when they sent their winged imaginations circling amongst the lamps of the night? Here she paused. She too was overcome, and the welling tears ran down her cheeks. I was myself more moved than I can say. This was indeed my Margaret, and in the consciousness of her presence, my heart leapt. Out of my happiness came boldness, and I dared to say now what I had feared would be impossible, something which would call the attention of Mr. Trelawny to what I imagined was the dual existence of his daughter.
As I
took Margaret's hand in mine and kissed it, I said to her father, "Why, sir, she couldn't speak more eloquently if the very spirit of Queen Tera was with her to animate her and suggest thoughts." Mr. Trelawny's answer simply overwhelmed me with surprise. It manifested to me that he too had gone through just such a process of thought as my
own.
And what if it was, if it is? I know well that the spirit of her mother is within her. If in addition there be the spirit of that great and wondrous queen, then she would be no less dear to me, but doubly dear. Do not have fear for her, Malcolm Ross. At least have no more fear than you may have for the rest of us. Margaret took up the theme, speaking so quickly that her words seemed a continuation of her father's, rather than an interruption of them. Have no special fear for me, Malcolm. Queen Tera knows, and will offer us no harm.
I know it.
I know it, as surely as I am lost in the depth of my own love for you. There was something in her voice so strange to me that I looked quickly into her eyes. They were bright as ever, but veiled to my seeing the inward thought behind them as are the eyes of a caged lion. Then the two other men came in and the subject changed. Chapter 18. The Lesson of the Ka. That night we all went to bed early. The next night would be an anxious one, and Mr. Trelawny thought that we should all be fortified with what sleep we
Could get.
The day, too, would be full of work. Everything in connection with the great experiment would have to be gone over so that at the last we might not fail from any unthought of flaw in our working. We made, of course, arrangements for summoning aid in case such should be needed, but I do not think that any of us had any real apprehension of danger. Certainly we had no fear of such danger from violence as we had had to guard against in London during Mr. Trelawny's long trance. For my own part, one felt a strange sense of relief in the matter. I had accepted Mr. Trelawny's reasoning that if the Queen were indeed such as we surmised, such as indeed we now took for granted, there would not be any opposition on her part, for we were carrying out her own wishes to the very last. So far I was at ease, far more at ease than earlier in the day I should have thought possible, but there were other sources of trouble, which I could not blot out from my mind. Chief amongst them was Margaret's strange condition. If it was indeed that she had in her own person a dual existence, what might happen when the two existences became one? Again and again, and again I turned this matter over in my mind, till I could have shrieked out in nervous anxiety. It was no consolation to me to remember that Margaret was herself satisfied and her father acquiescent. Love is, after all, a selfish thing, and it throws a black shadow on anything between which and the light it stands. I seemed to hear the hands go round the dial of the clock. I saw darkness turn to gloom, and gloom to gray, and gray to light without pause or hindrance to the succession of my miserable feelings. At last, when it was decently possible, without the fear of disturbing others, I got up. I crept along the passage to find if all was well with the others, for we had arranged that the door of each of our rooms should be left slightly open so that any sound of disturbance would be easily and distinctly heard. One and all slept. I could hear the regular breathing of each, and my heart rejoiced that this miserable night of anxiety was safely past. As I knelt in my own room in a burst of thankful prayer, I knew in the depths of my own heart the measure of my fear. I found my way out of the house and went down to the water by the long stairway cut in the rock. A swim in the cool, bright sea braced my nerves and made me my old self again. As I came back to the top of the steps, I could see the bright sunlight rising from behind me, turning the rocks across the bay to glittering gold. And yet, I felt somehow disturbed. It was all too bright, as it sometimes is before the coming of a storm. As I paused to watch it, I felt a soft hand on my shoulder, and, turning, found Margaret close to me, Margaret as bright and radiant as the morning glory of the sun. It was my own Margaret this time, my old Margaret without alloy of any other, and I felt that, at least, this last and fatal day was well begun. But alas, the joy did not last. When we got back to the house from a stroll around the cliffs, the same old routine of yesterday was resumed. Gloom and anxiety, hope, high spirits, deep depression, and apathetic aloofness. But it was to be a day of work, and we all braced ourselves to it with an energy which wrought its own salvation. After breakfast, we all adjourned to the cave, where Mr. Trelawny went over, point by point, the position of each item of our paraphernalia. He explained, as he went on, why each piece was so placed. He had with him the great rolls of paper with the measured plans and the signs and drawings which he had made from his own and Corbeck's rough notes. As he had told us, these contained the whole of the hieroglyphics on walls and ceilings and floor of the tomb in the Valley of the Sorcerer. Even had not the measurements, made to scale, recorded the position of each piece of furniture, we could have eventually placed them by a study of the cryptic writings and symbols. Mr. Trelawny explained to us certain other things, not laid down on the chart, such as, for instance, that the hollowed part of the table was exactly fitted to the bottom of the magic coffer, which was therefore intended to be placed on it. The respective legs of this table were indicated by differently shaped uraei outlined on the floor, the head of each being extended in the direction of the similar uraeus twined round the leg. Also, that the mummy, when laid on the raised portion in the bottom of the sarcophagus, seemingly made to fit the form, would lie head to the west and feet to the east, thus receiving the natural earth currents. If this be intended, he said, as I presume it is, I gather that the force to be used has something to do with magnetism or electricity, or both. It may be, of course, that some other force, such, for instance, as that emanating from radium, is to be employed. I have experimented with the latter, but only in such small a quantity as I could obtain, but so far as I can ascertain, the stone of the coffer is absolutely impervious to its influence. There must be some such unsusceptible substances in nature. Radium does not seemingly manifest itself when distributed through pitchblende, and there are doubtless other such substances in which it can be imprisoned. Possibly, these may belong to that class of inert elements discovered or isolated by Sir William Ramsay. It is therefore possible that in this coffer, made from an aerolite and therefore perhaps containing some element unknown in our world, may be imprisoned some mighty power which is to be released on its opening. This appeared to be an end of this branch of the subject, but as he still kept the fixed look of one who is engaged in a theme, we all waited in silence. After a pause, he went on. There is one thing which has up to now, I confess, puzzled me. It may not be of prime importance, but in a matter like this, where all is unknown, we must take it that everything is important. I cannot think that in a matter worked out with such extraordinary scrupulosity, such a thing should be overlooked. As you may see by the ground plan of the tomb, the sarcophagus stands near the north wall, with the magic coffer to the south of it. The space covered by the former is left quite bare of symbol or ornamentation of any kind. At the first glance, this would seem to imply that the drawings had been made after the sarcophagus had been put into its place. But a more minute examination will show that the symbolization on the floor is so arranged that a definite effect is produced. See here, the writings run in correct order, as though they had jumped across the gap. It is only from certain effects that it becomes clear that there is a meaning of some kind. What that meaning may be is what we want to know. Look at the top and bottom of the vacant space, which lies west and east, corresponding to the head and foot of the sarcophagus. In both are duplications of the same symbolization, but so arranged that the parts of each one of them are integral portions of some other writing running crosswise. It is only when we get a coup d'oeil from either the head or the foot that you recognize that there are symbolizations. See, they are in triplicate at the corners and the center of both top and bottom. In every case, there is a sun cut in half by the line of the sarcophagus, as by the horizon, close behind each of these and faced away from it, as though in some way dependent on it, is the vase which, in hieroglyphic writing, symbolizes the heart of the Egyptians called it. Beyond each of these, again, is the figure of a pair of widespread arms turned upwards from the elbow. This is the determinative of the ka, or double, but its relative position is different at top and bottom. At the head of the sarcophagus, the top of the ka is turned towards the mouth of the vase, but at the foot the extended arms point away from it. The symbolization seems to mean that during the passing of the sun from west to east, from sunset to sunrise, or through the underworld, otherwise night, the heart, which is material even in the tomb and cannot leave it, simply revolves so that it can always rest on Ra, the sun god, the origin of all good, but that the double, which represents the active principle, goes whither it will, the same by night as by day. If this be correct, it is a warning, a caution, a reminder that the consciousness of the mummy does not rest, but is to be reckoned with. Or it may be intended to convey that after the particular night of the resurrection, the ka would leave the heart altogether, thus typifying that in her resurrection the queen would be restored to a lower and purely physical existence. In such case, what would become of her memory and the experiences of her wide-wandering soul? The chiefest value of her resurrection would be lost to the world. This, however, does not alarm me. It is only guesswork after all, and is contradictory to the intellectual belief of the Egyptian theology that the ka is an essential portion of humanity. He paused, and we all waited. The silence was broken by Dr. Winchester. But would not all this imply that the queen feared intrusion of her tomb? Mr. Trelawny smiled as he answered, "My dear sir, she was prepared for it. The grave robber is no modern application of endeavor. He was probably known in the Queen's own
dynasty.
Not only was she prepared for intrusion, but, as shown in several ways, she expected it. The hiding of the lamps in the serdab and the institution of the avenging treasurer shows that there was defense, positive as well as negative. Indeed, from the many indications afforded in the clues laid out with the most consummated thought, we may almost gather that she entertained it as a possibility that others, like ourselves, for instance, might in all seriousness undertake the work which she had made, ready for her own hands when the time should have come. This very matter that I have been speaking of is an instance. The clue is intended for seeing
eyes.
Again, we were silent. It was Margaret who spoke. Father, may I have that chart? I should like to study it during the day. Certainly, my dear, answered Mr. Trelawny heartily, as he handed it to her. He resumed his instructions in a different tone, a more matter-of-fact one, suitable to a practical theme which had no mystery about it. I think you had better all understand the working of the electric light in case any sudden contingency should arise. I dare say you have noticed that we have a complete supply in every part of the house so that there need not be a dark corner anywhere. This I had specially arranged. It is worked by a set of turbines moved by the flowing and ebbing tide, after the manner of the turbines at Niagara. I hope by this means to nullify accident and to have, without fail, a full supply ready at any time. Come with me and I will explain the system of circuits and point out to you the taps and the fuses. I could not but notice, as we went with him all over the house, how absolutely complete the system was, and how he had guarded himself against any disaster that human thought could foresee. But out of the very completeness came a fear. In such an enterprise as ours, the bounds of human thought were but narrow. Beyond it lay the vast of divine wisdom and divine power. When we came back to the cave, Mr. Trelawny took up another theme. We have now to settle definitely the exact hour at which the great experiment is to be made. So far as science and mechanism go, if the preparations are complete, all hours are the same. But as we have to deal with preparations made by a woman of extraordinarily subtle mind, and who had full belief in magic and had a cryptic meaning in everything, we should place ourselves in her position before deciding. It is now manifest that the sunset has an important place in the arrangements, as those suns, cut so mathematically by the edge of the sarcophagus, were arranged a full design. We must take our cue from this.
Again, we find all along that the
number 7 has had an important bearing on every phase of the Queen's thought and reasoning and action. The logical result is that the 7th hour, after sunset, was the time fixed on. This is borne out by the fact that on each of the occasions when action was taken in my house, this was the time chosen. As the sun sets tonight in Cornwall at 8, our hour is to be 3 in the morning. He spoke in a matter-of-fact way, though with great gravity, but there was nothing of mystery in his word or manner. Still, we were all impressed to a remarkable degree. I could see this in the other men, by the pallor that came on some of their faces, and by the stillness and unquestioning silence with which the decision was received. The only one who remained in any way at ease was Margaret, who had lapsed into one of her moods of abstraction, but who seemed to wake up to a note of gladness. Her father, who was watching her intently, smiled. Her mood was, to him, a direct confirmation of his theory. For myself, I was almost overcome. The definite fixing of the hour seemed like the voice of doom. When I think of it now, I can realize how a condemned man feels at his sentence, or at the sounding of the last hour he is to hear. There could be no going back now. We were in the hands of God. The hands of God. And yet, what other forces were arrayed?
What
would become of us all, poor atoms of earthly dust whirled in the wind, which cometh whence and goeth whither no man may know? It was not for myself, Margaret. I was recalled by Mr. Trelawny's firm voice. Now we shall see to the lamps and finish our preparations. Accordingly we set to work, and under his supervision made ready the Egyptian lamps, seeing that they were well filled with the cedar oil, and that the wicks were adjusted and in good order. We lighted and tested them one by one, and left them ready so that they would light at once and evenly. When this was done, we had a general look round, and fixed all in readiness for our work at night. All this had taken time, and we were, I think, all surprised when, as we emerged from the cave, we heard the great clock in the hall chime 4. We had a late lunch, a thing possible without trouble in the present state of our commissariat arrangements. After it, by Mr. Trelawny's advice, we separated, each to prepare in our own way for the strain of the coming night. Margaret looked pale and somewhat overwrought, so I advised her to lie down and try to sleep. She promised that she would. The abstraction, which had been upon her fitfully all day, lifted for the time. With all her old sweetness and loving delicacy, she kissed me good-bye for the present. With the sense of happiness which this gave me, I went out for a walk on the cliffs. I did not want to think, and I had an instinctive feeling that fresh air, and God's sunlight, and the myriad beauties of the works of his hand would be the best preparation of fortitude for what was to come. When I got back, all the party were assembling for a late tea. Coming fresh from the exhilaration of nature, it struck me as almost comic that we, who were nearing the end of so strange, almost monstrous, an undertaking, should be yet bound by the needs and habits of our lives. All the men of the party were grave. The time of seclusion, even if it had given them rest, had also given opportunity for thought. Margaret was bright, almost buoyant, but I missed about her something of her usual spontaneity. Towards myself there was a shadowy air of reserve, which brought back something of my suspicion. When tea was over, she went out of the room, but returned in a minute with the roll of drawing which she had taken with her earlier in the day. Coming close to Mr. Trelawny, she said, "Father, I have been carefully considering what you said today about the hidden meaning of those suns and hearts and cause, and I have been examining the drawings again." "And with what result, my child?" asked Mr. Trelawny eagerly. "There is another reading possible, and that—" His voice was now tremulous with anxiety. Margaret spoke with a strange ring in her voice, a ring that cannot be, unless there is the consciousness of truth behind it. "It means that at the sunset the ka is to enter the and it is only at the sunrise that it will leave it." "Go on," said her father hoarsely. "It means that for this night the queen's double, which is otherwise free, will remain in her heart, which is mortal and cannot leave its prison place in the mummy shrouding. It means that when the sun has dropped into the sea, Queen Tera will cease to exist as a conscious power till sunrise, unless the great experiment can recall her to waking life. It means that there will be nothing whatever for you or others to fear from her in such way as we have all cause to remember. Whatever change may come from the working of the great experiment, there can come none from the poor, helpless, dead woman who has waited all those centuries for this night, who has given up to the coming hour all the freedom of eternity, won in the old way, in hope of a new life in a new world such as she longed for." She stopped suddenly. As she had gone on speaking, there had come with her words a strange, pathetic, almost pleading tone which touched me to the quick. As she stopped, I could see, before she turned away her head, that her eyes were full of tears. For once the heart of her father did not respond to her feeling. He looked exultant, but with a grim masterfulness which reminded me of the set look of his stern face as he had lain in the trance. He did not offer any consolation to his daughter in her sympathetic pain. He only said, "We may test the accuracy of your surmise and of her feeling when the time comes." Having said so, he went up the stone stairway and into his own room. Margaret's face had a troubled look as she gazed after him. Strangely enough, her trouble did not, as usual, touch me to the quick. When Mr. Trelawney had gone, silence reigned. I do not think that any of us wanted to talk. Presently Margaret went to her room, and I went out on the terrace over the sea. The fresh air and the beauty of all before helped to restore the good spirits which I had known earlier in the day. Presently I felt myself actually rejoicing in the belief that the danger which I had feared from the Queen's violence on the coming night was obviated. I believed in Margaret's belief so thoroughly that it did not occur to me to dispute her reasoning. In a lofty frame of mind, and with less anxiety than I had felt for days, I went to my room and lay down on the sofa. I was awaked by Corbeck calling to me, hurriedly, "Come down to the cave as quickly as you can. Mr. Trelawney wants to see us." All there at once. Hurry. I jumped up and ran down to the cave. All were there except Margaret, who came immediately after me carrying Silvio in her arms. When the cat saw his old enemy, he struggled to get down, but Margaret held him fast and soothed him. I looked at my watch. It was close to 8. When Margaret was with us, her father said directly, with a quiet insistence, which was new to me, "You believe, Margaret, that Queen Tera has voluntarily undertaken to give up her freedom for this night? To become a mummy and nothing more, till the experiment has been completed? To be content that she shall be powerless under all and any circumstances until after all is over and the act of resurrection has been accomplished, or the effort has failed?" After a pause, Margaret answered in a low voice, "Yes." In the pause, her whole being, appearance, expression, voice, manner had changed. Even Silvio noticed it, and with a violent effort wriggled away from her arms. She did not seem to notice the act. I expected that the cat, when he had achieved his freedom, would have attacked the mummy, but on this occasion he did not. He seemed too cowed to approach it. He shrunk away, and with a piteous meow came over and rubbed himself against my ankles. I took him up in my arms, and he nestled there content. Mr. Trelawney spoke again. "You are sure of what you say? You believe it with all your soul?" Margaret's face had lost the abstracted look. It now seemed illuminated with the devotion of one to whom is given to speak of great things. She answered in a voice which, though quiet, vibrated with conviction, "I know it. My knowledge is beyond belief." Mr. Trelawney spoke again. "Then you are so sure that were you Queen Tera herself, you would be willing to prove it in any way that I might suggest?" "Yes, any way." The answer rang out fearlessly. He spoke again in a voice in which was no note of doubt. "Even in the abandonment of your familiar to death, to annihilation." She paused, and I could see that she suffered horribly. There was in her eyes a hunted look which no man can, unmoved, see in the eyes of his beloved. I was about to interrupt when her father's eyes, glancing round, with a fierce determination, met mine. I stood silent, almost spellbound. So, also the other men. Something was going on before us which we did not understand. With a few long strides, Mr. Trelawney went to the west side of the cave and tore back the shutter which obscured the window. The cool air blew in and the sunlight streamed over them both, for Margaret was now by his side. He pointed to where the sun was sinking into the sea in a halo of golden fire, and his face was as set as flint. In a voice whose absolute uncompromising hardness I shall hear in my ears at times till my dying day, he said, "Choose. Speak. When the sun has dipped below the sea, it will be too late." The glory of the dying sun seemed to light up Margaret's face, till it shone as if lit from within by a noble light, as she answered, "Even that." Then stepping over to where the mummy cat stood on the little table, she placed her hand on it. She had now left the sunlight, and the shadows looked dark and deep over her. In a clear voice she said, "Were I Tera, I would say, take all I have. This night is for the gods alone." As she spoke, the sun dipped, and the cold shadow suddenly fell on us.
We
All stood still for a while. Silvio jumped from my arms and ran over to his mistress, rearing himself up against her dress, as if asking to be lifted.
He
Took no notice whatever of the mummy now. Margaret was glorious, with all her wonted sweetness, as she said sadly, "The sun is down, father. Shall any of us see it again? The night of nights is."
Come.
Chapter 19. The Great Experiment. If any evidence had been wanted of how absolutely one, and all of us had, come to believe in the spiritual existence of the Egyptian queen, it would have been found in the change which in a few minutes had been effected in us by the statement of voluntary negation made, we all believed, through Margaret. Despite the coming of the fearful ordeal, the sense of which it was impossible to forget, we looked and acted as though a great relief had come to us. We had indeed lived in such a state of terrorism during the days when Mr. Trelawny was lying in a trance that the feeling had bitten deeply into us. No one knows till he has experienced it what it is to be in constant dread of some unknown danger which may come at any time and in any
Form.
The change was manifested in different ways, according to each nature. Margaret was sad. Dr. Winchester was in high spirits and keenly observant. The process of thought which had served as an antidote to fear, being now relieved from this duty, added to his intellectual enthusiasm. Mr. Corbeck seemed to be in a retrospective rather than a speculative mood.
I
Was myself rather inclined to be gay. The relief from certain anxiety regarding Margaret was sufficient for me for the time. As to Mr. Trelawny, he seemed less changed than any. Perhaps this was only natural, as he had had in his mind the intention for so many years of doing that in which we were tonight engaged, that any event connected with it could only seem to him as an episode, a step to the end. His was that commanding nature which looks so to the end of an undertaking that all else is of secondary importance. Even now, though his terrible sternness relaxed under the relief from the strain, he never flagged nor faltered for a moment in his purpose. He asked us men to come with him, and going to the hall we presently managed to lower into the cave an oak table, fairly long and not too wide, which stood against the wall in the hall. This we placed under the strong cluster of electric lights in the middle of the cave. Margaret looked on for a while, then all at once her face blanched, and in an agitated voice she said, "What are you going to do, father?" "To unroll the mummy of the cat. Queen Tera will not need her familiar
tonight.
If she should want him, it might be dangerous to us, so we shall make him safe. You are not alarmed, dear?" "Oh no," she answered quickly. "But I was thinking of my Silvio and how I should feel if he had been the mummy that was to be unswathed." Mr. Trelawny got knives and scissors ready and placed the cat on the table. It was a grim beginning to our work, and it made my heart sink when I thought of what might happen in that lonely house in the mid-gloom of the
Night.
The sense of loneliness and isolation from the world was increased by the moaning of the wind which had now risen ominously, and by the beating of waves on the rocks below. But we had too grave a task before us to be swayed by external manifestations. The unrolling of the mummy began. There was an incredible number of bandages, and the tearing sound, they being stuck fast to each other by bitumen and gums and spices, and the little cloud of red pungent dust that arose, pressed on the senses of all of us. As the last wrappings came away, we saw the animal seated before us.
He
Was all hunkered up. His hair and teeth and claws were complete. The eyes were closed, but the eyelids had not the fierce look which I expected.
The
whiskers had been pressed down on the side of the face by the bandaging, but when the pressure was taken away they stood out, just as they would have done in life. He was a magnificent creature, a tiger cat of great size. But as we looked at him, our first glance of admiration changed to one of fear, and a shudder ran through each one of us, for here was a confirmation of the fears which we had endured. His mouth and his claws were smeared with the dry, red stains of recent
blood.
Dr. Winchester was the first to recover. Blood in itself had small, disturbing quality for him. He had taken out his magnifying glass and was examining the stains on the cat's mouth. Mr. Trelawny breathed loudly, as though a strain had been taken from him. "It is as I expected," he said. "This promises well for what is to follow." By this time Dr. Winchester was looking at the red-stained paws. "As I
expected," he said.
"He has 7 claws, too." Opening his pocketbook, he took out the piece of blotting paper marked by Silvio's claws, on which was also marked in pencil a diagram of the cuts made on Mr. Trelawny's wrist. He placed the paper under the mummy cat's paw. The marks fitted exactly. When we had carefully examined the cat, finding, however, nothing strange about it but its wonderful preservation, Mr. Trelawny lifted it from the table. Margaret started forward, crying out, "Take care, father, take care. He may injure you." "Not now, my dear," he answered as he moved towards the stairway. Her face fell. "Where are you going?" she asked in a faint voice. "To the kitchen," he answered. "Fire will take away all danger for the future. Even an astral body cannot materialize from ashes." He signed to us to follow him. Margaret turned away with a sob. I went to her, but she motioned me back and whispered, "No, no. Go with the others. Father may want you."
"Oh,
"It seems like murder." The poor queen's pet. The tears were dropping from under the fingers that covered her eyes. In the kitchen was a fire of wood ready laid. To this Mr. Trelawny applied a match. In a few seconds the kindling had caught, and the flames leaped. When the fire was solidly ablaze, he threw the body of the cat into it.
For a
few seconds it lay a dark mass amidst the flames, and the room was rank with the smell of burning hair. Then the dry body caught fire too. The inflammable substances used in embalming became new fuel, and the flames roared. A few minutes of fierce conflagration, and then we breathed freely. Queen Tera's familiar was no more. When we went back to the cave, we found Margaret sitting in the dark.
She
had switched off the electric light, and only a faint glow of the evening light came through the narrow openings. Her father went quickly over to her and put his arms round her in a loving, protective way. She laid her head on his shoulder for a minute and seemed comforted. Presently, she called to me, "Malcolm, turn up the light." I carried out her orders and could see that, though she had been crying, her eyes were now dry. Her father saw it too, and looked glad. He said to us in a grave tone, "Now we had better prepare for our great work. It will not do to leave anything to the last." Margaret must have had a suspicion of what was coming, for it was with a sinking voice that she asked, "What are you going to do now?" Mr. Trelawny, too, must have had a suspicion of her feelings, for he answered in a low tone, "To unroll the mummy of Queen Tera." She came close to him and said, pleadingly in a whisper, "Father, you are not going to unswathe her. All you men."
And in the glare
of light. "But why not, my dear? Just think, father, a woman, all alone, in such a way, in such a place.
Oh,
It's cruel, cruel." She was manifestly much overcome. Her cheeks were flaming red, and her eyes were full of indignant tears. Her father saw her distress and, sympathizing with it, began to comfort her. I was moving off, but he signed to me to stay. I took it that after the usual manner of men he wanted help on such an occasion, and manlike wished to throw on someone else the task of dealing with a woman in indignant distress. However, he began to appeal first to her reason. "Not a woman, dear, a mummy. She has been dead nearly 5,000 years. What does that matter? Sex is not a matter of years. A woman is a woman. If she had been dead 5,000 centuries, and you expect her to arise out of that long sleep, it could not be real death if she is to rise out of it. You have led me to believe that she will come alive when the coffer is opened. I did, my dear, and I believe it. But if it isn't death that has been the matter, with her all these years, it is something uncommonly like it. Then again, just think. It was men who embalmed her. They didn't have women's rights or lady doctors in ancient Egypt, my dear. And besides, he went on more freely, seeing that she was accepting his argument, if not yielding to it. We men are accustomed to such things. Corbeck and I have unrolled 100 mummies, and there were as many women as men amongst them.
Doctor.
Winchester in his work has had to deal with women as well as men, till custom has made him think nothing of sex. Even Ross has in his work as a barrister. He stopped suddenly. You are going to help too, she said to me, with an indignant look. I said nothing. I thought silence was best. Mr. Trelawny went on hurriedly. I could see that he was glad of interruption, for the part of his argument concerning a barrister's work was becoming decidedly weak. My child, you will be with us yourself. Would we do anything which would hurt or offend you? Come now, be reasonable. We are not at a pleasure
Party.
We are all grave men, entering gravely on an experiment which may unfold the wisdom of old times and enlarge human knowledge indefinitely, which may put the minds of men on new tracks of thought and research.
An
experiment, as he went on, his voice deepened, which may be fraught with death to any one of us, to us all. We know from what has been that there are, or may be, vast and unknown dangers ahead of us, of which none in the house today may ever see the end. Take it, my child, that we are not acting lightly, but with all the gravity of deeply earnest men. Besides, my dear, whatever feelings you or any of us may have on the subject, it is necessary for the success of the experiment to unswathe her. I think that under any circumstances it would be necessary to remove the wrappings before she became again a live human being instead of a spiritualized corpse with an astral body. Were her original intention carried out, and did she come to new life within her mummy wrappings, it might be to exchange a coffin for a
grave.
She would die the death of the buried alive.
But now, when she has
voluntarily abandoned for the time her astral power, there can be no doubt on the subject. Margaret's face cleared. All right, father, she said as she kissed him.
But, oh,
it seems a horrible indignity to a queen and a woman. I was moving away to the staircase when she called me. Where are you going? I came back and took her hand and stroked it as I answered. I shall come back when the unrolling is over. She looked at me long, and a faint suggestion of a smile came over her face as she said, Perhaps you had better stay, too. It may be useful to you in your work as a barrister. She smiled out as she met my eyes, but in an instant she changed. Her face grew grave and deadly white. In a faraway voice she said, Father is right. It is a terrible occasion. We need all to be serious over it.
But
all the same, nay, for that very reason you had better stay, Malcolm. You may be glad later on that you were present tonight. My heart sank down at her words, but I thought it better to say nothing. Fear was stalking openly enough amongst us already. By this time Mr. Trelawny, assisted by Mr. Corbeck and Dr. Winchester, had raised the lid of the ironstone sarcophagus, which contained the mummy of the Queen. It was a large one, but it was none too big.
The
mummy was both long and broad and high, and was of such weight that it was no easy task, even for the four of us, to lift it out. Under Mr. Trelawny's direction we laid it out on the table prepared for it. Then and then only did the full horror of the whole thing burst upon me. There, in the full glare of the light, the whole material and sordid side of death seemed staringly real. The outer wrappings, torn and loosened by rude touch, and with the color either darkened by dust or worn light by friction, seemed creased as by rough treatment. The jagged edges of the wrapping cloths looked fringed, the painting was patchy, and the varnish chipped. The coverings were evidently many, for the bulk was great.
But
Through all showed that unhideable human figure, which seems to look more horrible when partially concealed than at any other time. What was before us was death and nothing else. All the romance and sentiment of fancy had disappeared. The two elder men, enthusiasts who had often done such work, were not disconcerted, and Dr. Winchester seemed to hold himself in a businesslike attitude, as if before the operating table. But I felt low-spirited and miserable and ashamed, and besides I was pained and alarmed by Margaret's ghastly pallor. Then the work began. The unrolling of the mummy cat had prepared me somewhat for it, but this was so much larger and so infinitely more elaborate that it seemed a different thing. Moreover, in addition to the ever-present sense of death and humanity, there was a feeling of something finer. In all this, the cat had been embalmed with coarser materials. Here, all, when once the outer coverings were removed, was more delicately done.
it
Seemed as if only the finest gums and spices had been used in this embalming. But there were the same surroundings, the same attendant red dust and pungent presence of bitumen. There was the same sound of rending which marked the tearing away of the bandages. There were an enormous number of these, and their bulk when opened was great.
as the
Men unrolled them. I grew more and more excited.
I did not take a part in it.
Myself, Margaret had looked at me gratefully as I drew back. We clasped hands and held each other hard. As the unrolling went on, the wrappings became finer, and the smell less laden with bitumen, but more pungent.
We
All, I think, began to feel it as though it caught or touched us in some special
way.
This, however, did not interfere with the work. It went on uninterruptedly. Some of the inner wrappings bore symbols or pictures. These were done sometimes wholly in pale green color, sometimes in many colors, but always with a prevalence of green. Now and again Mr. Trelawny or Mr. Corbeck would point out some special drawing before laying the bandage on the pile behind them, which kept growing to a monstrous height. At last we knew that the wrappings were coming to an end. Already the proportions were reduced to those of a normal figure of the manifest height of the queen, who was more than average height. And as the end drew nearer, so Margaret's pallor grew, and her heart beat more and more wildly, till her breast heaved in a way that frightened me. Just as her father was taking away the last of the bandages, he happened to look up and caught the pained and anxious look of her pale face. He paused, and taking her concern to be as to the outrage on modesty, said in a comforting way, "Do not be uneasy, dear.
See,
There is nothing to harm you. The queen has on a robe. Aye, and a royal robe, too." The wrapping was a wide piece the whole length of the body. It being removed, a profusely full robe of white linen had appeared, covering the body from the throat to the feet. And such linen! We all bent over to look at it. Margaret lost her concern, in her woman's interest in fine stuff. Then the rest of us looked with admiration, for surely such linen was never seen by the eyes of our age. It was as fine as the finest silk, but never was spun or woven silk which lay in such gracious folds, constrict though they were by the close wrappings of the mummy cloth, and fixed into hardness by the passing of thousands of years. Round the neck it was delicately embroidered in pure gold with tiny sprays of sycamore, and round the feet, similarly worked, was an endless line of lotus plants of unequal height, and with all the graceful abandon of natural
growth.
Across the body, but manifestly not surrounding it, was a girdle of jewels.
A
Wondrous girdle, which shone and glowed with all the forms and phases and colors of the sky. The buckle was a great yellow stone, round of outline, deep and curved, as if a yielding globe had been pressed down. It shone and glowed, as though a veritable sun lay within. The rays of its light seemed to strike out and illumine all round. Flanking it were two great moonstones of lesser size, whose glowing, beside the glory of the sunstone, was like the silvery sheen of moonlight. And then on either side, linked by golden clasps of exquisite shape, was a line of flaming jewels, of which the colors seemed to glow. Each of these stones seemed to hold a living star, which twinkled in every phase of changing light. Margaret raised her hands in ecstasy. She bent over to examine more closely, but suddenly drew back and stood fully erect at her grand height. She seemed to speak with the conviction of absolute knowledge as she said, "That is no cerement. It was not meant for the clothing of death.
It is a
marriage robe." Mr. Trelawney leaned over and touched the linen robe. He lifted a fold at the neck, and I knew from the quick intake of his breath that something had surprised him. He lifted yet a little more, and then he, too, stood back and
pointed, saying,
"Margaret is right. That dress is not intended to be worn by the dead.
See,
her figure is not robed in it. It is but laid upon her." He lifted the zone of jewels and handed it to Margaret. Then with both hands he raised the ample robe and laid it across the arms which she extended in a natural impulse. Things of such beauty were too precious to be handled with any but the greatest care. We all stood awed at the beauty of the figure which, save for the face cloth, now lay completely nude before us. Mr. Trelawney bent over and with hands that trembled slightly, raised this linen cloth which was of the same fineness as the robe. As he stood back and the whole glorious beauty of the Queen was revealed, I felt the rush of shame sweep over me. It was not right that we should be there, gazing with irreverent eyes on such unclad beauty. It was indecent. It was almost sacrilegious. And yet the white wonder of that beautiful form was something to dream of. It was not like death at all. It was like a statue carven in ivory by the hand of a Praxiteles. There was nothing of that horrible shrinkage which death seems to effect in a moment. There was none of the wrinkled toughness which seems to be a leading characteristic of most mummies. There was not the shrunken attenuation of a body dried in the sand as I had seen before in museums. All the pores of the body seemed to have been preserved in some wonderful way. The flesh was full and round, as in a living person, and the skin was as smooth as satin. The color seemed extraordinary. It was like ivory, new ivory, except where the right arm, with shattered, blood-stained wrist and missing hand had lain bare to exposure in the sarcophagus for so many tens of centuries. With a womanly impulse, with a mouth that drooped with pity, with eyes that flashed with anger, and cheeks that flamed, Margaret threw over the body the beautiful robe which lay across her arm. Only the face was then to
be seen.
This was more startling even than the body, for it seemed not dead, but alive. The eyelids were closed, but the long, black, curling lashes lay over. On the cheeks, the nostrils, set in grave pride, seemed to have the repose, which, when it is seen in life, is greater than the repose of death. The full, red lips, though the mouth was not open, showed the tiniest white line of pearly teeth within. Her hair, glorious in quantity and glossy black as the raven's wing, was piled in great masses over the white forehead, on which a few curling tresses strayed like tendrils. I was amazed at the likeness to Margaret, though I had had my mind prepared for this by Mr. Corbeck's quotation of her father's statement. This woman, I could not think of her as a mummy or a corpse, was the image of Margaret as my eyes had first lit on her. The likeness was increased by the jeweled ornament which she wore in her hair, the disc and plumes, such as Margaret, too, had worn. It, too, was a glorious jewel, one noble pearl of moonlight luster, flanked by carven pieces of moonstone. Mr. Trelawney was overcome as he looked. He quite broke down, and when Margaret flew to him and held him close in her arms and comforted him, I Heard him murmur brokenly. "It looks as if you were dead, my child." There was a long silence. I could hear without the roar of the wind, which was now risen to a tempest, and the furious dashing of the waves far below. Mr. Trelawny's voice broke the spell. "Later on we must try and find out the process of embalming. It is not like any that I know. There does not seem to have been any opening cut for the withdrawing of the viscera and organs, which apparently remain intact within the body. Then, again, there is no moisture in the flesh, but its place is supplied with something else, as though wax or stearine had been conveyed into the veins by some subtle process. I wonder, could it be possible that at that time they could have used paraffin? It might have been, by some process that we know not, pumped into the veins, where it hardened. Margaret, having thrown a white sheet over the Queen's body, asked us to bring it to her own room, where we laid it on her bed. Then she sent us away, saying, 'Leave her alone with me. There are still many hours to pass, and I do not like to leave her lying there, all stark in the glare of light. This may be the bridal she prepared for, the bridal of death, and at least she shall wear her pretty robes.' When presently she brought me back to her room, the dead Queen was dressed in the robe of fine linen with the embroidery of gold, and all her beautiful jewels were in place. Candles were lit around her, and white flowers lay upon her breast. Hand in hand we stood looking at her for a while. Then with a sigh, Margaret covered her with one of her own snowy sheets. She turned away, and after softly closing the door of the room, went back with me to the others who had now come into the dining room. Here we all began to talk over the things that had been and that were to be. Now, and again I could feel that one or other of us was forcing conversation,
as if we were not sure of ourselves.
The long wait was beginning to tell on our nerves. It was apparent to me that Mr. Trelawny had suffered in that strange trance more than we suspected, or than he cared to show. True, his will and his determination were as strong as ever, but the purely physical side of him had been weakened somewhat. It was indeed only natural that it
should be.
No man can go through a period of 4 days of absolute negation of life without being weakened by it somehow. As the hours crept by, the time passed more and more slowly. The other men seemed to get unconsciously a little drowsy. I wondered if, in the case of Mr. Trelawny and Mr. Corbeck, who had already been under the hypnotic influence of the Queen, the same dormance was manifesting itself.
Dr.
Winchester had periods of distraction which grew longer and more frequent as the time wore on. As to Margaret, the suspense told on her exceedingly, as might have been expected in the case of a woman. She grew paler and paler still, till at last, about midnight, I began to be seriously alarmed about her. I got her to come into the library with me and tried to make her lie down on a sofa for a little
while,
as Mr. Trelawny had decided that the experiment was to be made. Exactly at the 7th hour after sunset, it would be as nearly as possible 3 o'clock in the morning, when the great trial should be made. Even allowing a whole hour for the final preparations, we had still 2 hours of waiting to go through, and I promised faithfully to watch her and to awake her at any time she might name. She would not hear of it, however.
She
thanked me sweetly and smiled at me as she did so, but she assured me that she was not sleepy and that she was quite able to bear up, that it was only the suspense and excitement of waiting that made her pale. I agreed, perforce, but I kept her talking of many things in the library for more than an hour, so that at last, when she insisted on going back to her father's room, I felt that I had at least done something to help her pass the time. We found the 3 men sitting patiently in silence, with manlike fortitude. They were content to be still when they felt they had done all in their power. And so we waited. The striking of 2 o'clock seemed to freshen us all up. Whatever shadows had been settling over us during the long hours preceding seemed to lift at once, and we went about our separate duties alert and with alacrity.
We
Looked first to the windows to see that they were closed, and we got ready our respirators to put them on when the time should be close at hand.
We
Had from the first arranged to use them, for we did not know whether some noxious fume might not come from the magic coffer when it should be opened. Somehow, it never seemed to occur to any of us that there was any doubt as to its opening. Then, under Margaret's guidance, we carried the mummied body of Queen Tera from her room into her father's and laid it on a couch. We put the sheet lightly over it so that if she should wake she could at once slip from under it. The severed hand was placed in its true position on her breast, and under it the jewel of 7 stars which Mr. Trelawny had taken from the great safe. It seemed to flash and blaze as he put it in its place. It was a strange sight and a strange experience. The group of grave silent men carried the white still figure, which looked like an ivory statue when, through our moving, the sheet fell back, away from the lighted candles and the white flowers. We placed it on the couch in that other room, where the blaze of the electric lights shone on the great sarcophagus fixed in the middle of the room, ready for the final experiment, the great experiment, consequent on the researches during a lifetime of these two traveled scholars. Again, the startling likeness between Margaret and the mummy, intensified by her own extraordinary pallor, heightened the strangeness of it all. When all was finally fixed, 3/4 of an hour had gone, for we were deliberate in all our doings. Margaret beckoned me, and I went out with her to bring in Silvio. He came to her purring. She took him up and handed him to me, and then did a thing which moved me strangely and brought home to me keenly the desperate nature of the enterprise on which we were embarked. One by one, she blew out the candles carefully and placed them back in their usual places. When she had finished, she said to me,
"They are done with now.
Whatever comes, life or death, there will be no purpose in their using now." Then, taking Silvio into her arms and pressing him close to her bosom where he purred loudly, we went back to the room. I closed the door carefully behind me, feeling as I did so a strange thrill as of finality. There was to be no going back now. Then we put on our respirators and took our places as had been arranged. I was to stand by the taps of the electric lights beside the door, ready to turn them off or on as Mr. Trelawny should direct. Dr. Winchester was to stand behind the couch so that he should not be between the mummy and the sarcophagus. He was to watch carefully what should take place with regard to the Queen. Margaret was to be beside him. She held Silvio ready to place him upon the couch or beside it when she might think right. Mr. Trelawny and Mr. Corbeck were to attend to the lighting of the lamps. When the hands of the clock were close to the hour, they stood ready with their linstocks. The striking of the silver bell of the clock seemed to smite on our hearts like a knell of doom.
1, 2,
3. Before the third stroke, the wicks of the lamps had caught, and I had turned out the electric light. In the dimness of the struggling lamps, and after the bright glow of the electric light, the room and all within it took weird shapes, and all seemed in an instant to change. We waited with our hearts beating. I know mine did, and I fancied I could hear the pulsation of the others. The seconds seemed to pass with leaden wings. It were as though all the world were standing still. The figures of the others stood out dimly, Margaret's white dress alone showing clearly in the gloom. The thick respirators which we all wore added to the strange appearance. The thin light of the lamps showed Mr. Trelawny's square jaw and strong mouth and the brown shaven face of Mr. Corbeck. Their eyes seemed to glare in the
light.
Across the room, Dr. Winchester's eyes twinkled like stars, and Margaret's blazed like black suns. Silvio's eyes were like emeralds. Would the lamps never burn up? It was only a few seconds in all till they did blaze up. A slow, steady light, growing more and more bright, and changing in color from blue to crystal
white.
So they stayed for a couple of minutes without change in the coffer. till at last there began to appear all over it a delicate glow. This grew and grew, till it became like a blazing jewel, and then like a living thing whose essence of life was light. We waited and waited, our hearts seeming to stand still. All at once there was a sound like a tiny muffled explosion, and the cover lifted right up on a level plane a few inches. There was no mistaking anything now, for the whole room was full of a blaze of light. Then the cover, staying fast at one side, rose slowly up on the other, as though yielding to some pressure of balance. The coffer still continued to glow. From it began to steal a faint greenish smoke. I could not smell it fully on account of the respirator, but even through that, I was conscious of a strange pungent odor.
Then,
this smoke began to grow thicker and to roll out in volumes of ever increasing density till the whole room began to get obscure. I had a terrible desire to rush over to Margaret, whom I saw through the smoke still standing erect behind the couch. Then, as I looked, I saw Dr. Winchester
sink down.
He was not unconscious, for he waved his hand back and forward, as though to forbid anyone to come to him. At this time the figures of Mr. Trelawny and Mr. Corbeck were becoming indistinct in the smoke which rolled round them in thick billowy clouds. Finally, I lost sight of them altogether. The coffer still continued to glow, but the lamps began to grow dim. At first I thought that their light was being overpowered by the thick black smoke, but presently I saw that they were, one by one, burning
out.
They must have burned quickly to produce such fierce and vivid flames. I waited and waited, expecting every instant to hear the command to turn up the light, but none came. I waited still, and looked with harrowing intensity at the rolling billows of smoke still pouring out of the glowing casket, whilst the lamps sank down and went out one by one. Finally there was but one lamp alight, and that was dimly blue and flickering. The only effective light in the room was from the glowing casket. I kept my eyes fixed toward Margaret. It was for her now that all my anxiety was
claimed.
I could just see her white frock beyond the still white shrouded figure on the couch. Silvio was troubled. His piteous mewing was the only sound in the room. Deeper and denser grew the black mist, and its pungency began to assail my nostrils as well as my eyes. Now the volume of smoke coming from the coffer seemed to lessen, and the smoke itself to be less
dense.
Across the room, I saw something white move where the couch was. There were several movements. I could just catch the quick glint of white through the dense smoke in the fading light, for now the glow of the coffer began quickly to subside. I could still hear Silvio, but his mewing came from close under. A moment later, I could feel him piteously crouching on my foot. Then the last spark of light disappeared, and through the Egyptian darkness, I could see the faint line of white around the window blinds.
I felt that the
time had come to speak, so I pulled off my respirator and called out, "Shall I turn up the light?" There was no answer, so before the thick smoke choked me, I called again but more loudly, "Mr. Trelawny, shall I turn up the light?" He did not answer, but from across the room I heard Margaret's voice, sounding as sweet and clear as a bell. "Yes, Malcolm." I turned the tap, and the lamps flashed out, but they were only dim points of light in the midst of that murky ball of smoke. In that thick atmosphere there was little possibility of illumination. I ran across to Margaret, guided by her white dress, and caught hold of her and held her hand. She recognized my anxiety and said at once, "I am all right. Thank God." I said, "How are the others?" "Quick, let us open all the windows and get rid of the smoke." To my surprise, she answered in a sleepy way, "They will be all right. They won't get any harm." I did not stop to inquire how or on what ground she formed such an opinion, but threw up the lower sashes of all the windows and pulled down the upper. Then I threw open the door. A few seconds made a perceptible change as the thick, black smoke began to roll out of the windows. Then the lights began to grow into strength, and I could see the room. All the men were overcome. Beside the couch, Dr. Winchester lay on his back as though he had sunk down and rolled over. And on the farther side of the sarcophagus, where they had stood, lay Mr. Trelawny and Mr. Corbeck. It was a relief to me to see that, though they were unconscious, all three were breathing heavily, as though in a stupor. Margaret still stood behind the couch. She seemed at first to be in a partially dazed condition, but every instant appeared to get more command of herself. She stepped forward and helped me to raise her father and drag him close to a window. Together we placed the others similarly, and she flew down to the dining room and returned with a decanter of brandy. This we proceeded to administer to them all in turn. It was not many minutes after we had opened the windows when all three were struggling back to consciousness. During this time, my entire thoughts and efforts had been concentrated on their restoration, but now that this strain was off, I looked round the room to see what had been the effect of the experiment. The thick smoke had nearly cleared away, but the room was still misty and was full of a strange, pungent, acrid odor. The great sarcophagus was just as it had been. The coffer was open, and in it, scattered through certain divisions or partitions wrought in its own substance, was a scattering of black ashes. Over all, sarcophagus, coffer, and, indeed, all in the room, was a sort of black film of greasy soot. I went over to the couch. The white sheet still lay over part of it, but it had been thrown back, as might be when one is stepping out of bed. But there was no sign of Queen Tera. I took Margaret by the hand and led her over. She reluctantly left her father, to whom she was administering, but she came docilely enough. I whispered to her as I held her hand, "What has become of the Queen? Tell me. You were close at hand and must have seen if anything happened." She answered me very softly. There was nothing that I could see. Until the smoke grew too dense, I kept my eyes on the couch, but there was no change. Then, when all grew so dark that I could not see, I thought I heard a movement close to me. It might have been Dr. Winchester, who had sunk down overcome, but I could not be sure. I thought that it might be the Queen waking, so I put down poor Silvio. I did not see what became of him, but I felt as if he had deserted me when I heard him mewing over by the door. I hope he is not offended with me. As if in answer, Silvio came running into the room and reared himself against her dress, pulling it as though clamoring to be taken up. She stooped down and took him up and began to pet and comfort him. I went over and examined the couch and all around it most carefully. When Mr. Trelawny and Mr. Corbeck recovered sufficiently, which they did quickly, though Dr. Winchester took longer to come round, we went over it afresh. But all we could find was a sort of ridge of impalpable dust, which gave out a strange dead odor. On the couch lay the jewel of the disc and plumes which the Queen had worn in her hair, and the star jewel which had words to command the gods. Other than this, we never got clue to what had happened. There was just one thing which confirmed our idea of the physical annihilation of the mummy. In the sarcophagus in the hall, where we had placed the mummy of the cat, was a small patch of similar dust. In the autumn, Margaret and I were married. On the occasion, she wore the mummy robe and zone, and the jewel which Queen Tera had worn in her hair. On her breast, set in a ring of gold make like a twisted lotus stalk, she wore the strange jewel of 7 stars which held words to command the God of all the worlds. At the marriage, the sunlight streaming through the chancel windows fell on it, and it seemed to glow like a living thing. The graven words may have been of efficacy, for Margaret holds to them, and there is no other life in all the world so happy as my own. We often think of the great Queen, and we talk of her freely. Once, when I said with a sigh that I was sorry she could not have waked into a new life in a new world, my wife, putting both her hands in mine and looking into my eyes with that faraway, eloquent, dreamy look which sometimes comes into
Her own, said lovingly.
Do not grieve for her. Who knows, but she may have found the joy she
Sought?
Love and patience are all that make for happiness in this world, or in the world of the past or of the future, of the living or the dead. She dreamed her dream, and that is all that any of us can ask. Thank you for joining us on this literary voyage. Don't forget to subscribe to Book Voyage Audio for more amazing stories. Until next time, happy listening.